Naughty Dog has consistently been one of the most revered developers in the video game industry. People have plenty of nostalgia for the Crash Bandicoot games on PlayStation 1, as the studio had developed the first major PlayStation mascot and advanced the technology of games like never before seen. Today, they're known for the action-packed thrills of the Uncharted series that debuted on PS3 and the emotionally gripping stories of the Last of Us games. What often goes unmentioned when discussing ND's impact on the industry is their PS2 franchise, Jak and Daxter. Today, I'm going to be addressing that by compiling all my Jak and Daxter coverage from 2022 into one easily bingeable video as I tell the story of the Jak and Daxter franchise and how it brought Naughty Dog from the days of Crash Bandicoot to Uncharted. Without further ado, let's begin. Man, it's crazy how much time flies. I mean, this game is 21 years old this year. For context, a 21-year-old game when Jak and Daxter hit the PS2 was Pac-Man in arcades. I don't know, it's just funny to me to think about how old games from the early 2000s are now, despite once being the apex of gaming. But since I'm on the subject of history, how did Jak and Daxter come to be? Well, like I said, the game was developed by Naughty Dog, who made a name for themselves in the PlayStation 1 with Crash Bandicoot, which first released in 1996. If you watched my video on Ratchet & Clank 1 last year, this story should be familiar. Crash was very successful, but this presented a problem in that Naughty Dog developed a good relationship with PlayStation, but Crash as a character was owned by Universal, so the profits on the Crash series got split 3 ways. So Naughty Dog decided that they were going to cut the middleman out and work directly with Sony on the PlayStation 2 with a new franchise, which meant saying goodbye to Crash, which I don't think was a mistake at all. They basically exhausted all they really could do with that series by Crash 3. A game full of different minigames and power-ups to really squeeze the juice out of that particular lemon. The last Crash game they did was Crash Team Racing in 1999, and while that was in development, members of the team got to work on conceptualizing their new game for the PlayStation 2. A console that was leaps and bounds more powerful than the PS1, giving Naughty Dog the vision for what this game was going to be. Before they even had characters and a story, the one-sentence description of the new game was that it was going to be an entirely seamless, load-time-free world. In games prior to this, especially on PlayStation 1, you'd beat a level, go to a loading screen, and get hit with a menu of some kind and then pick the next stage. Even when they did have characters and a story, one of the biggest talking points with the Precursor legacy was that you could walk on foot from the starting point of the game all the way to the final boss without seeing one loading screen. The manual, like Ratchet & Clank, is a giant pamphlet where one side shows the entire map of the game and how it connects, and in-game it lines up perfectly. The other side of the manual is this cool poster of Jak riding the Zoomer alongside an ad for Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. No real reason to mention that, it's just that it's the first game in the goated trilogy. How could I not mention it? Immersion was one of the biggest things they wanted to achieve with Jak 1, and the game not having to stop and load was one of the biggest achievements the team pulled off with this game. In the PlayStation Magazine article regarding Jak and Daxter, the writer even slipped in a dig at Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex, the game that had recently released on the PS2 and was the first Crash platformer not developed by Naughty Dog. Something made apparent with its lacking visuals and poor optimization as the game took upwards of 20 to 30 seconds to load in new stages. I'm sure Naughty Dog felt the same way as this writer though. To them, seeing their old series be more stagnant in this area only reaffirmed that they were going in a good direction with Jak. But that's all talk of what they wanted this game to feel like. What kind of game is this? Well, the basic concept is that you play as Jak, a mute character who loves adventure alongside his wisecracking friend Daxter. The two of them defy the demands of Samos the Sage and travel to Misty Island where they uncover a plot to destroy the world from 2 mysterious figures and their army of lurkers. Jak and Daxter walk up to a pool of dark eco, and once Daxter falls into it, he's turned into a half-otter, half-weasel called an Ottsel. And after getting chewed out by Samos, they learn that only Gol Acheron, the sage of dark eco, has a chance of returning Daxter to his human form. But since none of the other sages have turned their teleporter gates on for a while, they have to travel by foot with the help of Samos' daughter, Kira, the village mechanic. Samos is the sage of green eco, eco being the source that all life comes from. Each type of eco has a different sage: green, blue, red, yellow, and dark eco. Jak has a mysterious power to channel eco in a way nobody else can. The world is a very mysterious one because of the fact that it was created by the Precursors, but no one knows who they were and why they're gone, but they've left behind fascinating technological cities and machines you can see all throughout the game. And with all that set up, the player is good to go on their journey. But that merely answers what the plot is. What kind of game is this? When Naughty Dog was developing Crash for the PlayStation 1, they modeled the gameplay after what was already familiar to them. Games like Donkey Kong Country, but in a 3D space. This being the format that kept evolving as they made an entire trilogy out of it by 1998. When Crash 1 released on PS1, the N64 received Super Mario 64, the game that revolutionized how 3D platforming would feel from its analog stick movement to its mission-based item collection gameplay. This birthed the collectathon genre, where you'd search areas for collectibles that were tied to your progression. Point being, when doing their new PS2 epic, Naughty Dog wanted to move on from the level-to-level style that Crash had perfected in the 90s and do something more like Mario 64, but not a copy. One thing they often repeated in the promotional material for the game was that they wanted to have a mix between the platforming and item collection of Super Mario 64, but mix it with the epic scale and scope of Nintendo's other N64 classic, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. So that's what you get, an epic fantasy quest with Jak and his sarcastic sidekick Daxter as you journey across the land with platforming challenges in abundance as you scour the areas in search of Precursor orbs, a collectible currency, and power cells, the main thing that Jak and Daxter need to find in order to progress to different areas. So in spirit, it's the same kind of idea as Super Mario 64, but they stress that immersion in the world is one of their goals, like I said. This manifested in the gameplay because the objectives in Jak and Daxter are all contextualized. In Mario 64, you do tasks and objectives for no real reason besides the game telling you that was your current objective. In Jak, you can look at several missions to show how they designed a more thought-out world. In the Forbidden Jungle, you have one mission that sees Jak redirecting the Eco Beam from one lens to another. Why? Well, that's because the Eco Beam is what powers Sandover Village, and the mayor thinks the Eco Beam being down will kill his re-election, so he offers Jak and Daxter a power cell if they can fix it for him. Kira has sent 7 scout flies to every area in the game, and your reward for collecting them is a power cell. But the reason you collect them is because the lurkers captured all the scout flies in hidden boxes. You lose out on this power cell because a pelican eats it from the ground, so you have to chase the pelican to get it back. You lead the lightning moles back to their burrow in the Precursor Basin because the local geologist is concerned about them. You fire at these lurkers eating these support beams in the spider cave because Gordy, a local miner, tells you it's important to keep the cave intact. You rescue this muse on Misty Island because he belongs to the sculptor in Sandover Village and he needs it for his inspiration, and your reward is, you guessed it, a power cell. Not every mission is super fun. I mean, herding the yak cows for the farmer is really dull and is right at the start of the game, and I don't like aiming yellow eco to hit targets. I've just always felt like the aiming is really finicky. But I'm just saying that the world is cohesive. The end result is always you getting a power cell like any other collectathon, but each task achieves something in the world you're playing in. The missions also have cause and effect. Like how you rescue the Flut from this ledge in Sentinel Beach, and then that allows you to ride the Flut in the boggy swamp and the snowy mountain. To even reach Misty Island, you need to help the fisherman in the Forbidden Jungle, where he gives you a power cell and permission to use his speedboat. His regular boat is broken, and this is also contextualized as a part of the game.
Did you see the size of the bite that lurker shark took out of the fisherman's boat? We best stay way clear of them!
Naturally, there are boundaries in the world, but instead of having the player run into an invisible wall, if you swim out too far, you'll have to hear this sound. Which means that the lurker shark will eat you if you don't turn back fast enough. You get eaten by a shark for swimming too far out of bounds. I just think that that's clever. Of course, none of this would be nearly as effective without fun gameplay, and Jak and Daxter more than delivers on that. Jak is just one of those video game characters who's fundamentally enjoyable to control. His moveset's pretty simple. You run with the analog stick, jump with the X button, and pressing it again will double jump, square is a punch attack, square followed by X is an uppercut, circle's a spin attack, triangle goes into first person mode, which is contextualized on Jak's character design, by the way. The first person viewing mode is why Jak wears goggles. Figured I'd mention that. At a standstill, L1 allows Jak to crouch, and jumping in this state does a high jump, and on the move you roll and roll jump. In addition to that, Jak has the power to channel different types of eco. Blue eco making you move faster and allowing you to operate Precursor technology, green eco replenishing your health if you collect 50 small ones or one big one, red eco making your attacks far more powerful, killing everything in the surrounding area in one hit, and yellow eco allowing Jak to shoot fireballs from his hand. Just don't fall into dark eco, that's an instant game over. What I've always loved about Jak's moveset is how seamlessly you can transition between these things.
We've created kind of a unique system for blending different animations to create smooths between what would be two totally separate animations in most other games now. I'll give you an example of this. If you're running along, you may be halfway in speed between a walk and a run. Well, what our game will do is it'll take the walk animation, it'll take the run animation, and it'll evenly blend between them to create a new frame that represents where your feet would be if you're running at that speed.
His run can go right into a kick, and there's no pop or click, and it just is seamlessly smooth.
For example, you can uppercut into the air and then rapidly do a dive attack, and from there you can do a spin attack if you need to, or just keep diving back up and down. It feels great to use the roll as an attack by just barreling into the enemies and killing them in one hit. I also love using the high jump you get when jumping immediately out of the roll jump. It's super satisfying and it makes you feel like a gaming guru when you pull it off and make it look effortless. Jak is just very mobile, and that's fun to mess around with. Like in the first boss against this plant enemy. After you kill his minions, he shows you his weak spot that you're supposed to climb the pedals in order to hit. But if you have good timing, you can just uppercut right into the weak spot and damage him that way. Side note, I love how throughout the Forbidden Jungle you see these vines attack you from the ground, but once you kill this plant boss, those vines from before are all dead. Just some more world building. As I was saying, this is a moveset where things feel useful as attacks and as platforming options. I just said the roll, which is meant to pick up your speed, can be used as an attack. But the spin is another example where its primary function is to hurt enemies, but in the air you can use it to get some extra airtime and to break your fall from large heights. The combat is just so satisfying in this game because of how smooth it feels to execute these different commands, and when you hit an enemy, you feel it with the sound design. This game just looks and sounds great. I just brought up the sounds from attacking enemies, but then the music also amplifies the atmosphere. Josh Mansell returned from the Crash Bandicoot games to deliver the score for the Precursor legacy. A soundtrack with equal parts tranquil atmosphere, foreboding atmosphere, whimsy, mystery, frantic action, and climactic action whenever appropriate. The visuals are also stunning for 2001 standards, as the game renders all these different environments that have a variety of different enemies and high-quality textures with no visible loading screens. The game also sports an organic day-to-night transition with 2 different morning skyboxes for variety's sake, one with more bright yellow lighting and another with a green tint to capture the atmosphere of more subdued mornings. The graphics are great for their time, but what has not aged a day would be the animation. I think at the time of this game's release, the animation was simply unrivaled. In the gameplay, it's top-notch, exaggerating the character's movements with squash and stretch to make the gameplay more satisfying, like how Jak's arm extends when punching, or how when kicking or uppercutting, Daxter will go flying off of Jak's body, but his arms will cartoonishly stretch as he pulls himself back to you.
We're looking for impact that couldn't possibly be achieved through conventional means like motion capture. We want to see the character jump and stretch to twice as high, or if he's punching, we want to see that fist be twice as big as it normally is.
When running in low water, Jak will be slowed down and move like a human would in that situation. When you're swimming, you can see Daxter shivering from the water. When you're rolling, you can see Jak's hair go in the motion of the flip. This game is jam-packed with details in its animations. The greatest example being the various power cell grab animations, an iconic element of the series as they have a variety of different poses and moves from Daxter whenever you get one. They had several members of the dev team just working on the cinematics alone, some talent even coming from outside the video game industry like Disney and Nickelodeon to help perfect the animation. Despite the models looking blocky by today's standards, I can't help but be really impressed at just how much detail there is in the character's moves in every scene, like how Daxter's laughing at Samos for falling through the warp gate in the Red Sage's lab. Or just the way Daxter moves in most of the scenes would serve as a good example. The facial expressions also convey a wide range of emotions alongside the movements of the characters. This scene prior to the Claw boss fight serves as a good example.
Wait! I'll stay here and protect Kira. Jak, I think you're ready to handle that monster without me.
Oh, really heroic of you.
The only issue I could bring up with the cutscenes is just that they're unskippable. When you get into the game, this doesn't present a huge issue as there aren't that many cutscenes from start to finish, but the game opens on a lengthy scene of Jak and Daxter going to Misty Island and getting chewed out by Samos afterwards. The scene at the start of Volcanic Crater also goes on for a few minutes. This had to have been intentional since you could skip the cutscenes in the Crash games, so my only conclusion is that they thought that being able to skip the cutscenes would break the total immersion they were going for, or they just thought that the animation work they did was so great that players had to see them. It also could have been both of those things. The logic isn't faulty, the animation work is fantastic, but if you've played the game as many times as I have over the years, it does weigh on you a bit when getting back into it, knowing that the cutscene with Jak's uncle or the sculptor cannot be skipped when trying to go for 100% completion. I note this because I think the Precursor Legacy offers a lot in terms of replayability. For one thing, I love how each mission in the game has a reason to exist, like I said before, so each mission has a quest giver you can contact. However, you almost never have to talk to quest givers in order to do missions. For example, Kira tells Jak and Daxter that they could explore the temple in the Forbidden Jungle in order to activate the Blue Eco vents, but you don't actually have to activate this cutscene in order for the mission to be done. If you know what you're doing, you can just rescue the Muse from Misty Island, the Flut from the ledge, reroute the Eco Beams, release the Blimp from the Boggy Swamp, and destroy the Eco Crystals in the Spider Caves entirely without being told to do so, which cuts down on the amount of cutscenes you'd have to watch in a second playthrough. I literally did not know that the Support Beams mission in the Spider Cave was a quest you got from the miners until this playthrough. I just go to them for their 4 power cells. Nor did I remember that the Poison Plants mission in the Precursor Basin and the revisit to Misty Island were directives from Samos, but I don't have to remember that because the game doesn't require it. The only exceptions to this rule both come in the Precursor Basin, where you need to talk to this gambler in order to activate the racetrack you need to beat the best time on, and to rescue the lightning moles you'd have to talk to the geologist first. Jak also encourages replayability through my favorite subject, stage routing. When you start the game, you have the choice between going to the Forbidden Jungle or Sentinel Beach. The game encourages you to visit Sentinel Beach first, it being the simplest and easiest level in the entire game. But the catch is that to get on top of the tower with the cannon, you need the blue eco vent to be open, which can only be done in the Forbidden Jungle. So to cut down on backtracking, I actually play Forbidden Jungle first, then Sentinel Beach. A similar moment happens later in the game when you can go to either Snowy Mountain or the Spider Cave. But to go to Snowy Mountain, you have to ride this gondola, which you can only ride on after letting Kira and Samos into the lab, which is easy enough, but then you need to collect 2 more power cells. So therefore, you'd naturally go to Spider Cave first. But getting all the Precursor orbs in the final room of the Spider Cave requires the yellow eco vent to be open, which can be done at Snowy Mountain, which is where I go first between these two. Gordy and Willard in this cave sell you 4 power cells, which covers the 2 power cells required to get on the gondola. The only backtrack you have to do in the game is the Mountain Pass, the transition stage between Rock Village and Volcanic Crater. One of the power cells here is locked behind a rock wall that requires yellow eco to bust. But this is before you have access to Snowy Mountain to open the eco vent. So once you do it, you hop back on the zoomer and go backwards until you reach this point to open the path and get the power cell. But this is pretty minor at the end of the day. On my first run for the video, in fact, I almost forgot to do it. That would have been embarrassing, to reach the end of the final level and see I only had 100 power cells instead of 101. But on the note of the collectibles tally, that's another very addicting element of this game. Pausing the game shows you how you're doing with the various collectibles, with each collectible having its own tally. Whenever I think I'm done with a stage, I hit the pause screen and see all the power cells lit up, and that just activates the reward center, you know? That feeling of completion and getting closer and closer to your goals. I also love how each level has a set amount of Precursor orbs, and when you collect them all, you get this notification that you have done so, which also activates the same reward system I just mentioned. When doing a 100% run, one of the most satisfying moments is in the final level, where you walk towards the last power cell with the final few orbs on the way there, knowing you're about to reach that perfect 2000 out of 2000 on the Precursor orb tally, right before grabbing the 101st power cell. This game is just an epic quest, like the developers set out to make. Every time I revisit the Precursor legacy, I'm just taken aback by how addicting the gameplay loop is, how fun the controls are, how massive the scale is, and how you fully explore all these different areas, like a forest, a forgotten temple, a dark and mysterious island, a swamp, an ancient underwater city, a mountain, a cave, and many more in just a few hours' time. It's epic. Something you feel for the final time as you reach the final level, Gol and Maya's Citadel. Throughout the game, you can see that the lurkers are up to something big, but it's impossible for the players to know what it is. All you can do is stop them in their tracks, like on Misty Island. Samos gives Jak and Daxter credit for stopping the lurkers from opening a silo of dark eco that no doubt would have been used for a nefarious purpose. Similarly, in the Boggy Swamp, the lurkers are using a giant ship with a balloon on top to lift a Precursor robot out of the swamp, which you stop them from doing. Samos, again, says that this is a huge victory, although he doesn't know what they'd want a Precursor robot for. It all comes together when you reach Volcanic Crater and learn that the sages are gone because they've been captured by the villains we saw in the opening cutscene. This is Gol Acheron, the sage of Dark Eco, and his sister Maya. Needless to say, they don't plan on turning Daxter back into a human. The two have been so corrupted by Dark Eco that they now plan on harnessing enough of it to reshape the world completely. To achieve this, they plan to open the silos, the most vast source of Dark Eco in the world, but they need the power of a Precursor robot to do that. When you reach this level, you find out that Samos has been captured by them as well, so it's up to Jak and Daxter to get through Gol and Maya's Citadel to rescue each of the sages so they can help you get to the final boss arena. Gol and Maya's Citadel is a pretty interesting level, because of the fact that the aesthetic is like the Precursor levels we've played previously in the game, but on top of that is a layer of chaotic junk modded onto the area like circuit boards and wires. I just think it makes for an interesting visual mix. Despite stopping them from getting their robot in the swamp, they do still have one working that they've modded with their various scraps and intend to use that one to open the silos, setting the stage for the final boss. This is the culmination of my point that this is an epic adventure. When you get to the top of the elevator that takes you to the silos, you can see in the distance all the places you've been to get to this point, like the Snowy Mountain, and even seeing Geyser Rock and Misty Island out in the distance, just like the artwork promised and the devs claimed repeatedly in the pre-release. You did travel seamlessly from one side of this game world to the other, and now you just have to destroy this robot, making use of yellow and blue eco, powers you've been using throughout the game. And to cap it off, the sages combine their respective eco powers to combat the now open dark eco silos, and this creates a type of eco only rumored to exist before, light eco, which Jak uses to lay the final blow on the robot, sealing Gol and Maya inside the dark eco silos, saving the day. Ending the game as well.
Looks like I may have been too hard on you boys. You do have what it takes to be heroes.
Another thing that hits me whenever I replay this game is that a criticism I often see people levy against Jak and Daxter is that it's mechanically fine-tuned to near perfection, but the game doesn't have much personality. And you know what? I really think that's just not true. The reason people say it is because this game is one with a silent protagonist and a more simple story compared to, say, Ratchet and Clank, which released the year after this, which had a more developing story throughout the game, and a more contentious relationship between its two lead characters. And Sly Cooper also dropped in 2002, and I shouldn't even bring that game up. I mean, how does any game compare to the goated trilogy and come out unscathed? My point is that I see where the criticism comes from, but I personally think it's overstated and is also not true. The writing and characters of Jak I are more memorable than people give it credit for. When just looking at the story, I think it's an entertaining plot that's well told. You don't know who the mysterious villains are at the beginning, but they're clearly up to something throughout the whole game on your quest to find Gall to help Daxter get back to normal, but him being the villain connects the dots in your mind, setting up for the climax where Daxter, albeit reluctantly, decides to not use light eco to turn himself back to normal because using it to stop the robot is more important. It's not much, but I think what they did is good. And also, when getting into the memorability argument, it's really subjective, simply because my counter-argument is that I remember it quite well. The driving force of the cutscenes is Daxter, and the way he interacts with the various characters is unforgettable, if you ask me. Like,
Yeah, lightning molds. We care. Maybe for 2 power cells. Hey, that's one of your vital organs. Walk it off, tough guy.
the NPCs that bounce off of Daxter's energy are also memorable to me. Like when the warrior says,
So full of valor, armor shining in the sun, I climbed the hill to take him on. But he pounded me like one tenderizes a yakao steak.
Have you tried attacking him with your melodrama? 'Cause it's killing me.
most of the cutscenes are Daxter roasting the NPCs you meet, but my favorite cutscenes are with Daxter trading insults with Samos, who's my favorite character in the series, especially in this game where he's one of the few characters who just doesn't take anything from Daxter.
The two of you went mucking around in the only place that I told you not to go, Misty Island.
That's right. And then
And Daxter, you finally took a much-needed bath, but in a bathtub filled with dark eco.
Look, old man, are you gonna keep yapping, or are you gonna help me out of this mess?
I'm gonna keep yapping, because in my professional opinion, the change is an improvement.
But he also genuinely comes to respect the duo's efforts as the game goes on, despite laughing at the idea of them being heroes at the start of the game. The dialogue is burned into my brain for almost every cutscene, so I can't agree that this game lacks personality. I think it's exploding with it. Just not as much as Ratchet and Clank. People tend to hypothesize that the lacking personality was one of the biggest things Jak and Daxter had going against it upon release. But I don't think that tells the whole story. Looking back at the development of Jak and Daxter, it's like this game was lab engineered to be as popular as possible. When Naughty Dog designed the character of Crash, it clearly took inspiration from the Looney Tunes, very Western in style. However, Crash's design was changed in Japan to make him suitable for the market. Naughty Dog didn't want that to happen to Jak, so his design wasn't just their product. Sony of America, Sony of Europe, and Sony of Japan were all involved in giving feedback to the designs of Jak and Daxter, therefore designing characters that would be universally appealing all over the world. They got what they wanted since test audiences in Japan felt Jak had Western influences just going off of his build, but in the West, audiences felt he had anime influences with his hair and his ears. A mix of different art styles that made Jak feel at home in every region was the goal. They even said in the PlayStation magazine that if Jak doesn't reach the same audience as Crash, it wouldn't be for a lack of trying. And that's the thing. Jak and Daxter came out to raving reviews and sold very well. However, it did not sell as well as Crash, and the Jak sequels would suffer the effects of diminishing returns compared to the Crash sequels. As I said, people have cited Jak's character and the game's story as why this is. But I don't. His character is appealing in all regions. The game's story is charming. No, what happened was something Naughty Dog could not have possibly prepared for. 2001 was a big year for the PS2, with Jak and Daxter being the console's obligatory family game. But 2001 was a year that showed you really don't need a family game as the face of your console. Jak 1 is a perfectly executed game based upon the ideals of most 90s platformers, but the market had changed. We can go more in depth on this when covering Jak II next week, but let me put it like this. In the holiday season of 2001, the PS2 got iconic games like, yes, Jak and Daxter, but also Final Fantasy X, Silent Hill 2, and Devil May Cry, the first and the most based action franchise of all time, as well as that Gear game people seem to like, and most importantly, Grand Theft Auto 3. This game more or less changed the video game industry overnight. From a design standpoint, this game had taken the open world feel from the first two GTA games on PS1, but evolved it into being full 3D, adding an extra layer of immersion. I'm not going to say this game invented the sandbox genre, but needless to say, if you play any game today, or really any game in the last 20 years that involved you running around a large open world with tasks and objectives marked on a minimap or with waypoints, that game was influenced by Grand Theft Auto 3 in some way. But more importantly, GTA 3 changed the video game industry in a cultural sense. This game generated a large source of controversy back when it was released in 2001. Playing as an escaped convict doing various amounts of criminal activity just sparked a discussion about what was acceptable in video games. This debate ranged from video game websites rating it the most offensive game of 2001 to full-on news stations discussing the violent and sexual material depicted within the game. Now, the game was rated M, meaning players 17 and up could play it, but the discussion was more about if explicitly playing as the bad guy doing bad things like carjacking and beating innocent people up with a baseball bat and outrunning the law, alongside other things I won't mention to keep this video advertiser friendly, was something that even should be in a mainstream video game. Obviously, video games had controversies before GTA 3. I mean, the ESRB rating system was created in the 90s as a result of increasingly violent games, even if those had more limited graphics compared to what GTA 3 and now games of today had in them. But this one was different. Despite all the controversy caused by Grand Theft Auto 3, it clearly didn't make a change because the PS2 alone got 2 more GTA games, and then the series continued on to GTA 4 and GTA 5, which they then ported endlessly for the next 9 years. But why? Well, GTA 3 was the highest selling game of 2001. First, controversy sells, this much is a fact. The game getting so much media attention only put more spotlight onto it and made more people curious to try it. But more importantly, GTA 3 came out in the early 2000s, which I think is fundamentally the largest demographic shift the gaming industry has ever seen, and then I'd argue will ever see. Now, really strap in, because it may seem like this has nothing to do with Jak, but bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Just by looking at the context of the early 2000s in gaming, you'll see why this demographic shift happened and how it was more or less inevitable. In the 80s and into the 90s, video games were largely considered a children's thing. It still is today, however, seeing a video game console in a home that does not contain children is pretty normal. This is just a mainstream thing for people of all ages and demographics nowadays. More mature games existed in the 90s like boomer shooters, Mortal Kombat, and a plethora of rated M PS1 games, but like I said, I think it's fair to say that back in the 80s and 90s, games were more or less considered a children's hobby. That's the audience they were appealing to, after all. But the generation that grew up on the first Nintendo largely didn't stop playing games into their older years. If you were 5 years old when Super Mario Bros. Came out in 1985, then by the release of the PlayStation 2 in 2000, you'd be 20 years old. Maybe during the PS1 era, this demographic thought games like Mario and Crash were cool, but also got enjoyment out of the mature games that were making the rounds as well. But by the release of GTA 3 in 2001, this age group was well into their 20s. These were full adults still playing the newest video games with their own money. A new, large portion of the audience. So as a result, in the early 2000s, the mature games just became the biggest and most popular ones. See GTA 3, MGS2, Halo 1, and the list goes on. Games like Metal Gear Solid 2 demonstrated that game players were willing and interested in more complex plot lines. And I should note, I always throw digs at the Metal Gear series, but old fans of mine should know that I'm only 75% kidding when I say I don't like MGS like I used to. Games like Devil May Cry show that the main character can have a little more personality without being straight up annoying. And games like Halo Combat Evolved on Microsoft's Xbox really went to show that the face of a console didn't have to be a colorful mascot platformer. But then you might be wondering, what's the problem here? Can't both audiences coexist? Well, they could, and they definitely did, but GTA 3 type games being the most popular game for adults affected all audiences. That's how we circle back to Jak and Daxter. Jak and Daxter was a success. It broke new ground on animation and world design, got great reviews, and sold well, but it did not reach the audience of Crash simply because the time of its release was the time the industry was changed forever. And that's that. But when looking at what Naughty Dog did, they made a great game regardless of all that context. I think this game is a true masterpiece because of its rewarding gameplay and satisfying feel. It's a game I can always come back to and know I'll have a good time with, and that's gotta be worth something. The game will always be well made and fun, regardless of whether or not it topped the charts like its contemporaries may have. Which still, like I said, it's not even like it didn't succeed. It's a landmark game in the early PS2 days. I'm just saying that in terms of popularity, it was just the right game at the wrong time. On an episode of Dev Plays where Tim Schafer played video games alongside one of the lead designers on that particular game, Jason Rubin explained this change in the audience better than I ever could, so I'll let him say it.
We had already started working on Jak II, and I remember doing a focus group and 2 8-year-olds were in this focus group. And I was like, so what do you think? And they acted like 16-year-olds, like 8-year-olds. Well, the graphics are good, and we really like the gameplay. We like what you're doing and the expansion of the universe. Really, this would be a fantastic game for our little brothers. And you're like, you're 8. What are you playing? Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
And it just changed everything.
Focus groups.
So yeah, Naughty Dog, seeing that the kinds of games they had made were just falling out of style, wasn't sure if continuing Jak and Daxter was really something worth doing. So they came to an agreement with Sony that there was still a lot more you could do with Jak and Daxter that hadn't been done, so they radically transformed the identity of Jak and Daxter into something much different. This is where the divisive elements of the game come in. Some feel like the Jak sequels are a transparent attempt to desperately grab the mainstream audience, shining a light on how the Precursor legacy was basically doing the same thing just with a different audience. I don't see it that way because, like I said at the beginning, Jak II is one of my favorite games. And today we're going to be exploring all the things that Jak II does to evolve this series and the gaming industry in positive ways, and then also gush over why I enjoy it as much as I do. So strap in. This might be a slightly longer video than usual, but I think it's worth it, because we're talking about Jak II.
For every age, there is a time of trial. The rocks faced such a fire before they were the strength beneath our feet. The plants braved vast winds before their roots could give us life. As a sage of considerable years, I have known only one such great ordeal. Yet the hero it created was a champion for all time.
Had to let that full sequence play out. I've always felt like the opening monologue from Samos really got me in gear for an epic story, much more than the opening monologue from Jak 1. Jak 2 places much more emphasis on story than the previous game. The first game had a little over half an hour's worth of cinematics, but Jak 2 has over 90 minutes of cutscenes telling a much more in-depth story than the first game. Jason Rubin said this when promoting Jak 1, that the gamers want more. For the same exact price, but they want more. So it was time for Naughty Dog, as a studio, to take the plot more seriously. So what are we dealing with here? Well, if you got 100 power cells in Jak 1, then you'd see Jak, Daxter, Kira, and Samos react to opening this giant door that flashed white. If you look at fully completing games as a method of obtaining a cool reward, this is pretty lame, but in my case, I like to complete that game because I find it rewarding intrinsically. But this ending did serve to set up a sequel, and here we are. The group has taken what was inside of the door and somehow lugged it all the way back to Samos' hut. What they found was a giant precursor ring and a rift rider to travel through it. In order to activate it, Jak has to use his special powers to make it work, which caused the rift gate to open as monsters tear through alongside their leader. The group manages to escape by going through the rift, but Jak and Daxter get separated from Kira and Samos, landing in a place completely different from what they're used to. A whole city walled off from the rest of the world called Haven City, patrolled by the Crimson Guard, who seemingly knew Jak was going to be here and captured him as Daxter makes a getaway. 2 years later, we see that Jak has been held as a prisoner of Baron Praxis, the dictator ruling Haven City. Praxis and his right-hand man, Errol, have been performing torturous Dark Eco experiments on Jak as a part of their Dark Warrior program. This allows Jak to tap into the Dark Eco in his body to transform into a destructive monster called Dark Jak. This also taking away Jak's previous Eco powers. The point of the experiment is to give them an edge in their war against the metalheads that threaten to destroy the city. The same monsters that came through the rift at the beginning. After 2 years of this, Praxis rules the Dark Warrior program as a failure and says to kill Jak later since they aren't getting the results they want. But Daxter miraculously comes to the rescue as we get this moment here that changes the dynamic of the series and sets the stage for Jak II.
I've been looking for you for 2 years! Say something! Just this once!
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
Yeah, Jak can now fully speak. This was a tricky one for the team because, like I said in the last video, Jak was a mute character. He never spoke one word of dialogue throughout the entire game, and that's because they just thought a character with his own personality would distract from the immersion of the game. But other games at the time had characters with their own personalities that weren't annoying or just terribly voice acted, so it was time for a change. Jak now speaks in most of the cutscenes. They tried to make it as smooth of a transition as possible. In an earlier version of the story that you can read from the Jak II Design Bible, the original intention was to just have Jak start talking from the very beginning of the game, even though it takes place right after the first game's ending. That would have been jarring to the audience, so I'm glad they changed it to where, at the start of Jak II, Jak is exactly who he was in the first game, but 2 years of Dark Eco experiments later, Jak is pissed and ready for action. as Daxter remarks a few times in the early scenes that it's weird for Jak to now talk. But that's just to say to the audience, yeah, Jak talks now, you gotta just go along with it. I think the change was for the better. Jak I had funny moments as a result of Daxter being the one who could talk.
I'm Daxter. Here's Jak. He's with me.
Good job, Daxter.
But Jak II gives the duo back and forth throughout the game, and I find that much more entertaining.
Whoa! Got it. Where would you be without me, eh, Dax?
Well, Jak, I probably wouldn't be 2 feet tall, fuzzy, and running around in a sewer without a pair of pants. God, I miss pants.
Special shout out to Mike Irwin, who brought the character of Jak to life. I can't put it any better than Naughty Dog did in the behind the scenes video. You look at the art of Jak in this game and you hear the voice Mike does, and it's like, yeah, that's Jak.
So, who or what do we have to shake down, knock out, or blow up?
All in all, I think the game made the transition between Jak's old personality and his new one as gracefully as they could, but then they just move on once it's established. Back to the story. Jak and Daxter escape Praxis' prison and meet an old man named Core outside who's protecting a child who is apparently important. Core tells Jak and Daxter that there's a rebellion being waged against Baron Praxis called the Underground that he helps out, and that they should join. The Underground is led by someone called the Shadow, but when they join, they only deal with Torn until they prove themselves worthy of meeting the Shadow. So that's the big picture for the first act of the game. Jak and Daxter proving themselves to the Underground and meeting various people who live in Haven City, navigating characters with different motivations and tasks that they want you to do as you work your way up the ranks of the Underground, hoping to meet the Shadow and get revenge on Baron Praxis for what he's done to Jak, setting up the journey. Now, with all this talk of what's changed regarding Jak II coming off the first game, that naturally leads one to wonder how different the actual game is. The answer is, when playing as Jak, nothing is different. Jak's entire moveset from the Precursor legacy is still in Jak II. His punch, spin, uppercut, dive, roll jump, all that. Everything that made Jak fun to play in the first game is still present in Jak II. And they gave every action a really satisfying sound effect too, something I noticed when doing all of Jak's moves in rapid succession. Not a big deal, I'm just saying. Genuinely, the only change that I can think of is when jumping out of a dive, Jak will do this spin in the air instead of just jumping back into the air like he did in Jak I, which is a quality improvement in terms of making every animation seamless. But yeah, despite the game trying to age the series up a bit, the game is still built off the back of things that made Jak I's animation work, like squash and stretch in your attacks and Daxter's responses to your movements, and those things still work just as well in Jak II. Jak I made advancing the technology in games to another level one of its core elements, and Jak II keeps that going. Jak I had an option for a cropped 16:9 display, something other 2001 PS2 titles weren't doing, so that game was ahead of the curve on that. But Jak II adds to the graphical options by including a toggle for progressive scan, or a 480p resolution. Games running at 480p was a little more common on Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox, but on the PlayStation 2, a vast majority of games were running at 480i, which sees the image on screen flickering due to the way displays draw every frame in 480i, for technical reasons I don't care to explain. Point is, running at 480p produces a cleaner and more defined look that also puts Jak II on the small list of games for the PlayStation 2 that did have 480p support. The most impressive technical achievement in Jak II is the way the cutscenes are presented, though. This was the first game where Naughty Dog utilized cutscene models. In the gameplay, the models are pretty much the same quality as what you saw in Jak I, but Jak I used those gameplay character models in its cutscenes, where you could see how the models are dated today since you have to look at them up close. Jak II uses lower poly models for gameplay, but then made more detailed models for the cutscenes, where you'd be admiring the details of the characters much more. A character model from the Precursor legacy had about 3,000 polygons, but these cutscene models in Jak II will have close to 15,000, giving the characters more detail, like in Daxter's fur, Jak's hair, the clothes in the various characters. They just look fantastic, and then in motion it's even better. Jak II, even with its significantly higher cutscene count, still put great effort into the animation with fast movement, lots of detail and movements on the screen at once from the various characters, and expressive facial animation. With all these improvements over the first game, I figured I'd also mention that when playing on PS2 there are some technical issues compared to the first one. Jak I ran at a perfect 60 frames per second, and when a lot of action's going on in Jak II, the frame rate will dip to a degree where you would notice, even if it's not game-breaking. I also found pop-in very noticeable during my playthrough, where I'd get close to enemies and just see details appear on their models the closer I got. I also saw cases of visible culling of geometry, which I don't think you ever did in Jak I, or even Naughty Dog's Crash games on PS1. Much more distracting would be how frequent screen tearing is in this game. It's hard to spot when things are going really fast, however you might notice, in cutscenes especially, that things might seem jittery, and that's because of screen tearing. If you take any cutscene and look at it frame by frame, you'll notice what I'm saying. a line will just appear on the screen, especially when changing angles from one shot to another. But this also does happen in gameplay. In addition to that, I think the game's way of having no load screens is a little less impressive than Jak 1 when playing it, since in that game you could walk from Samos's hut to Golem Maya's citadel without having to wait. In Jak 2, you don't stop and see a screen that says, "Now loading," but the game definitely has loading zones like these passageways between areas that have these big gears on them. The door opens when the game is done loading. Jak 1 used cutscenes for loading like the ride to Misty Island from Sandover Village. I just think that overall Jak 1 disguised loading better than Jak 2, where you'll see a cutscene of you flying away and then cut to black for a few seconds before reaching the next area. As I'm sure you all know by now, I prefer playing my PS2 games on an actual PS2, but after years of having played this game on the 2012 HD collection and then going back to the PS2 release, you see that the loading in these rooms is much faster on PS3 than on PS2, as you'd expect. But then when playing on an original disc, it just makes the loading more apparent to me. Speaking of the HD collection though, that is how most people will experience this game these days, and all these issues from frame drops to screen tearing are not present there. It's only like that on PS2. While it sounds like I'm being negative towards Jak 2's visual presentation, I'm not. I'm just making sure that in the interest of balance that I point out the ways the game pushed the graphics forward, but also how it had new obstacles to performance as a result. I said these were technical inferiorities to Jak 1, but that just depends on your point of view. Technically, Jak 1 had a perfect frame rate and didn't see nearly as much pop-in or screen tearing, but that's not because Jak 2 is inferior technologically to Jak 1, that's because Jak 2 was pushing the limits of the PlayStation 2 hardware much more than the last game. More enemies on screen, more NPCs, a larger world. So yeah, maintaining these things without loading screens and doing that while targeting 60 FPS and including these high poly cutscene character models is going to be a lot tougher on the hardware than Jak 1, which didn't do any of that. But then when you level the playing field between the two on something like the PS3 HD collection, it's pretty obvious that Jak 2 is much more technologically advanced than its predecessor. And what I'm realizing is that we haven't even gotten into the meat of the game yet, and this video is already 2/3 the length of the Jak 1 video. What can I say? Being a big YouTuber sure does make you nitpicky. So having said that, once you're in the world of Jak 2, what do? Well, Haven City is where you're stuck for the entire game, and the city's divided into a couple of areas, but these are all blocked with security passes, so at first you only have access to the slums where the underground base is located. You go here and get objectives from Torn. You leave the base and then see the minimap displayed in the lower right as you follow these icons leading you to important destinations. This much works just like Grand Theft Auto 3, and it's pretty intuitive. By the end of the game, you'll know the map to Haven City pretty well. However, it's great that you have a map at all times that displays these icons and you just follow them as it takes you on the path to your next objective. But this is just how you get from place to place. The actual destinations make up the core content of Jak 2. Outside the security walls lie dangerous areas like Dead Town, where the Metalhead armies overwhelmed the Crimson Guard to the point of a retreat. The pumping station, which is also overrun by Metalheads. The sewers, the drill platform, the dig, and some others. Each time you visit these locations you have a mission to do, but then you keep coming back to these areas throughout the game, which might sound repetitive, but you always uncover something new in the process. I'll take the pumping station as an example. The first time you go here, you take a right from this platform because it's the only path available to you on your quest to turn the valve on that brings the water back to the slums. But the next time you go here is where you have to protect Sig while he hunts for giant metalheads. Sig uses his ultra-powerful Peacemaker gun to blow open this tank that allows you to go where you couldn't before. Then, the next time you go here, you find a pathway you hadn't taken before to meet Ashlyn, the Baron's daughter who's secretly working with the Underground while she's under attack from the metalheads. All the locations you visit are like this, where it may be the same area, but what you do is completely different each time, and what you see might also be different. It's like how your first mission at the dig is this jetboard challenge where you grind on rails to destroy this giant machine, but then the next time you visit here is a long mission with exploration, combat, and platforming to reach a seal piece you need to progress. Playing this game again has only reminded me of the fact that I do believe this is an authentic sequel to the first game from a gameplay perspective. I already mentioned the fact that Jak's entire moveset from the Precursor legacy is here and accounted for in Jak 2, so from that alone, players of the first game should have an easy time getting into Jak 2. But then when actually playing it, you see the game puts just as much of a focus on tight platforming in its levels as the first game. Areas like Praxis' Palace, the Dig, and Mars' Tomb show this off best, where you gotta time your swinging jumps right and land on moving platforms. So it's just as satisfying as it was in the first game to roll jump off of ledges and high jump off the platform you land on to make it to the next one. And when you're fast enough to get all the moving platform segments done in one cycle without waiting, you feel pretty rad. If anything, I think it might actually be more fun in Jak II than the first game, because the platforming segments throughout this game are actually more difficult, on average, than what you'd find in the first game. And more complex, too, as you have more movement options. Like the escape from Praxis' palace at the end of the game. You gotta make these perilous jumps over a bottomless pit while blasting the enemies from afar. And then at this moment, you gotta shoot the glass out of the window to grind along the ledge with your jet board. It's really fun and exciting. It's easy to think Jak II is a radical departure from the first game, and in many ways, it obviously is. But I think the core DNA of what the first game was trying to achieve is still in Jak II. By that I mean, on the surface, this game is not a colorful collectathon, obviously, but what was Jak I trying to do? Well, it wanted to take elements that games from the late 90s had utilized, like the platforming of Super Mario 64, the grand scale and story and mythology of Ocarina of Time or Final Fantasy, and paying attention to the details like Banjo-Kazooie, and combining those elements into something that had all of those things at once that felt fresh just the same, while impressing you with its jaw-dropping visuals and technology. Jak II just realized that the elements they were taking weren't what the industry was most impressed by anymore. So they still took their platforming-focused gameplay and thought, how do we adapt this into what's popular? So you have a game that tries to take the open-world mission-based gameplay from Grand Theft Auto and combining that with some creative gunplay and incorporate elements from Tony Hawk into the game for that extra youth appeal, and giving it a post-apocalyptic Blade Runner cyberpunk vibe as the backdrop of their more serious story while still playing exactly like Jak I. It's an interesting mix, but definitely feels like a sequel to Jak I, just not the one you'd expect. Now, that doesn't mean the implementation of these things is above criticism because mixing popular elements from other games is a staple of the series. Driving in Jak II is one of the main areas the game gets flack for. A lot of folks find it boring. Now, I've kind of flip-flopped on this issue over the years. In my earlier playthroughs back in the day, I found driving between missions to be the part where you get to relax from the challenge of the missions. That issue we'll talk about later, don't you worry. But then when I got better at the game, I tended to think that the long commute between areas just took up too much time in my playthrough. Now, I think there's still truth to that. You start in the slums, but then you gain access to this industrial district, a long sequence of passageways that leads to the port at the bottom of the map. You then gain access to the left side of the map where the gardens and the bazaar are located. And at the very top of the map is the stadium that leads to the main town, which is the most developed area and sees Praxis' palace at the very center, which stands tall above the rest of the city. The map in this game is pretty large. So, when you're in the port at the bottom and your next objective is located at the stadium, that's a pretty long drive. Same for being in the gardens and having to go all the way back to the slums and talk to Torn or whoever. It's just a long commute from area to area since there aren't a lot of shortcuts or easy ways to do it. However, I find the act of driving in Jak II fun. Like GTA, you get around by stealing people's cars, but technology has evolved in the Jak world to where the Zoomers you rode in Jak I are now capable of full flight and have different classes. The basic Zoomer is the fastest and the one you'd best grab if you want to move quickly, however, these are pretty vulnerable and blow up easily. Therefore, if your mission is to destroy something on the move, you're best grabbing a heavy vehicle which turns worse and moves slower, but the boost in defense is worth it for these missions. Sometimes you'll find a Crimson Guard bike just sitting around unoccupied, and these are the best moments, because then you feel all the benefits of grabbing that sweet ride, a fast hover bike with a cannon on the front, just without instantly setting the whole city on alert. When piloting these vehicles, you have to switch between the low zone and the hover zone, and I just think it's fun going really fast and weaving in and out of traffic by going high and going low, especially when on the run from the guards. So my overall stance is, at some moments driving can get old if it goes on for a few minutes, but for most of the game, I find it enjoyable. Even more fun than that is the new jet board. Jak and Daxter get their hands on a hoverboard that you first test out in this skating rink where you have to do combo tricks to get high points. This thing feels great to use, to the point where in this playthrough, when my drive was short enough, I'd even just take the jet board to where I was going because then I'd go mad with the tricks and the grind rails getting from place to place. If you do a perfect 360 spin, you get an instant speed boost and the controller vibrates when you land, which is great feedback. R1 allows you to do basic tricks like spins, but on L1 you can do these crazy combo tricks that grant you more points for comboing them together without touching the ground and just looks really sick. As a Jak II vet, using the jet board to get through basic segments gets more enjoyable with each run. Especially this late game mission in the strip mine that makes you use the jet board to grind on rails. Getting through here without dying and while maintaining the speed from the board is some good fun. But of course, if we're talking about Jak's extra gear, there's one elephant in the room.
Zeke! Pierre Capitan here and his friend, Bonus. If you want to see what that baby can do, try the gun course outside. Show me some skill with that hardware, and I'll hire you for a job or two, eh?
After the 5th mission, Jak and Daxter meet Crew and his right-hand man, Sig. Crew sends the 3 of them to hunt down some metalheads, but to make sure Jak has the firepower to watch Sig's back, you're granted the Morph Gun. I absolutely love everything about the Morph Gun. In Jak II, you have access to 4 weapons. First is the red scatter gun. Shortly after, you get the yellow blaster. Then a bit later, you get the blue Vulcan barrel. And towards the end of the game, you get the dark Peacemaker. These are 4 modes that the Morph Gun switches between. 4 modes the player switches between with the 4 D-pad buttons. The Morph Gun switching between these 4 settings is one of my favorite animations to look at in the game. Most of the time you won't even see it as the camera is behind Jak. When you do look at it, it's cool the gun doesn't just click or pop between settings. You can actually see the barrel change shape when switching between the modes as Jak holds each one differently and fires each one differently. It's such a neat way to bring guns into the Jak and Daxter series. You don't play as Jak firing some realistic assault rifle like it's Shadow the Hedgehog from 2005. This is a sci-fi weapon that you want to see up close since it's so original. You also want to see the various animations they gave Jak and Daxter when using it. I do say Daxter because they allow the player to fire guns while driving by having Daxter grab the morph gun from Jak's back while he's the one driving the vehicle. They also made each mode of the morph gun tie back to mechanics from the first game. I mentioned earlier that as a result of Praxis' Dark Eco experiments on Jak, he no longer has the ability to use Eco powers or interact with Precursor artifacts like he did in Jak I. But these guns are all made using the various Eco types as ammunition. In Jak I, Red Eco made your attacks more powerful and allowed you to easily wipe out small groups of close-by enemies. The Scatter Gun is a weaponized form of Red Eco that you use to blow enemies back from close range. Yellow Eco allowed Jak to shoot fireballs out of his hand, and so the Blaster is their basic gun that used to shoot enemies both close and from afar. Blue Eco made Jak run faster, so naturally, the Vulcan barrel shoots rapidly across the screen. And the Peacemaker uses Dark Eco to unload electric destruction all over the screen. These are very basic video game gun archetypes like the shotgun, the rifle, the Gatling gun, and the grenade launcher, but they take these familiar ideas and just give them a Jak and Daxter twist. Jak II's gunplay is very unconventional, but I love it. When you get the hang of it, there's nothing that plays quite like it. For example, you can't strafe around enemies in Jak II, but I don't feel like I ever needed it, because they designed weapons that were meant to be used alongside Jak's existing moveset. If you need distance, you roll jump away from the enemies and start shooting them, and the generous auto-aim will do the rest. Each weapon just feels really useful throughout the game. Like if you see a crowd of small enemies come rushing your way, you know to bust out the scatter gun and tear them to pieces. If you're in combat with the bigger enemies, you spin, kick, or punch them first and then fire the blaster to do 3 shots right on them. Something you get taught when you first unlock the weapon. When enemies are firing at you from afar, the Vulcan barrel will stop them dead in their tracks as you unload your ammo upon them, and then when surrounded by enemies or a tough boss in the late game, you use the Peacemaker to level the playing field. Not that there's only one use for weapons. As the blaster is great with distance, it just doesn't have the stun power of the Vulcan barrel. The scatter gun can put some room between you and the bigger enemies as its range is pretty big, but the rate of fire is slower than the blaster and less precision than the spin kick blaster maneuver. But all the weapons are viable in most combat situations, but each weapon does shine in its own areas. And for the millionth time, I just love the sound effects.
Right.
That's not to say every method of combat in Jak II is a hit. One of the main things advertised in this game is Jak's new transformation, Dark Jak, that has been unleashed thanks to the experiments. Defeated enemies will drop Dark Eco that fills up this gauge around your health bar. When it's full, you can press a button to become Dark Jak, but this barely gets used throughout the game. Your melee attacks are more powerful in this mode, but you go flying all over the screen to the point where you can barely control yourself. When activated, you're also stuck with it until the bar is depleted, meaning that if you do use it, you want it to be worth the full bar of Dark Eco, and most situations aren't like that. You can't use any weapons either. This is absolutely something you only use when you're desperate and surrounded by enemies, otherwise it's just not that useful. It kinda creates a weird disconnect between the gameplay and the story, since cutscenes say Jak is his vicious dark side from this transformation, but I never use it, so yeah. You do get upgrades for Dark Jak via Metalhead Skull Gems that you give to the Precursor Oracle. These are fun to use, like the Dark Bomb that clears enemies, or the Electric Dark Blast that clears boss health bars, but again, it doesn't make the form any more useful compared to your other options. Late in the game, you might get the Invincibility mode, which speaks for itself, and then finally there's the Dark Giant, where you can grow double your size and run rampant throughout the city like you're the Hulk or something. But I've never obtained this during the campaign, so it's not very useful to me. I've actually never fully completed this game as a whole. I mean, I've beaten the campaign plenty of times, trust me. But I mean that you can collect Precursor orbs like the first game, and Daxter explains these are worth a lot now because they're rarer than they were in Jak I. I just never bothered collecting them all because I don't see the point. Collecting all the Precursor orbs grants you neat extras like being able to rewatch cutscenes, replay missions, and view great concept art. But if I ever want to play Jak II, I'm just going to play the whole game, not individual missions or cutscenes. And the art's on Google at this point. For 200 Precursor orbs, you unlock Hero Mode, a harder version of the campaign. Maybe that's worth a live stream one day. We shall see. I've never played it before, and I don't really have the time now. I mean, have you seen how long this video has been thus far? Collecting Precursor orbs in this game involves searching through the tiniest nooks and crannies of every area, some of which are only accessible once in the campaign, and are otherwise just doing busy work like going through rings or reaching a destination before time runs out. Needless to say, I'm just fine doing the campaign. Although I should note, Hero Mode is unlocked with 200 orbs and there are 286 in the game, so you can miss a few, which is nice. But I'm now wildly off subject from what I was talking about a few moments ago, which was the game's combat. I was saying that it was pretty balanced and fun. I wasn't sure if I should just start out by saying that I thought it was balanced well, because that's not the common consensus. One of the main abilities Jak has with his guns is shooting them while spinning in the air. So many players have adopted this strategy of grabbing the blaster, jumping, spinning, and firing, sending shots all over the screen in the hopes they kill the enemies, believing this to be the dominant strategy of Jak II. I used to play like this myself, but in more recent years I stopped doing that as much. Only doing that when I had no health left and needed a quick Hail Mary before I got killed in the hopes I'd survive. But this is a bad strategy to rely on for most of the combat situations in the game. This video by PowerCell Zeke explains it pretty well. I'll link it below. When I first watched this video, the things I had been noticing about the game's combat were definitely validated, but I'll quickly sum it up. The jump, spin, shoot strat leaves it up to chance as to whether or not your shots will hit the enemies as they just fly all over the screen in random directions. This drains your ammo like it's nobody's business. When the blaster has much more accuracy just being used normally, and when enemies are firing at you from afar, it's much easier to grab the Vulcan barrel and shoot them, locking them in place before they die. In the Metalhead Nest at the end of the game, I was attacked by a group of small enemies and some big metalheads that fired lasers. What I did was bust out the scatter gun and kill the little guys with it, and then use the Vulcan barrel to stop the laser guys from firing while I wailed on them. If I just did the jump, spin, shoot, you can clearly see that I'm hitting the enemies, technically, but you see how much ammo is being wasted on shots that are not hitting anything, draining resources in the hope that I hit my foes with some of these stray shots. It can work, but you'll likely take damage and probably die because that's what happens to a lot of players when playing the game like this. When the true dominant strategy is using all your moves together, like punches and spin kicks on unarmed enemies, the scattergun on fast-moving tiny enemies, the blaster spin kick move on armed enemies, the Vulcan barrel on enemies from far away, and the Peacemaker on bullet sponges or boss fights. So yeah, I really have no issue saying that this game has a pretty balanced combat system when using all your tools together. The jump, spin, shoot strategy is a large contributor in why many players feel this game is very challenging. Believe me, if you think Jak II is a challenging game, I'm not calling you out. This isn't even a new position. The PlayStation Magazine review got flack from readers back in 2003 because of the fact that the author criticized Jak II for its difficulty balancing. A full magazine article was written on the top 10 hardest missions in Jak II. YouTubers have been discussing the difficulty of this game in their videos for well over a decade now. I just said that the jump, spin, shoot strategy is part of why, but really there are many factors in why this game is considered so difficult that have nothing to do with the player's capability or method of approach. In fact, I used to think this game was insanely difficult. I was right there with you guys spending 30 minutes on get the sealed piece from the slums or the final boss or the various racetrack missions. The game is tough as nails on the first playthrough. Side tangent, I know. But I just want to throw it out there that when I was a kid, I never made real progress in Jak 2 or 3, I just bumbled around causing trouble in the city. Whenever I recount this fact in a video, I then follow it up with, "Then later I tried to beat the game for the first time when I was older, in 2011. But it really dawns on me now that there's a much bigger gap between 2011 and now than Jak 2's release in 2003 and my finally beating it in 2011. There are people older than me who have felt this much more, but I'm just saying, I feel old and that's a new experience for someone in their 20s. Anyway, back to the game discussion. When fighting enemies in Jak 2, a problem you're bound to run into as a newcomer is the fact that Jak has no iframes when getting hit, so if you get cornered by a group of enemies, you'll take all that damage with no breathing room. This was true in Jak 1, but I never mentioned it because the lurkers were never the threat that the metalheads are in Jak 2. These guys are faster, have more attacks, are more aggressive, and have more projectiles, and more of them are on the screen. So now, iframes will trip up players more in Jak 2 than the Precursor Legacy. The other major issue with Jak 2's difficulty balancing is the checkpoints. There are several missions that just have no checkpoints at all. The escape from the palace at the end of the game is an example, but there are so many missions you could use as an example, like backing up Sig in the cavern or escorting these three morons to the Heart of Mar Gem. If you die, it's all the way back to the beginning of the mission. I don't think Jak II asks a lot of its players in the moment-to-moment gameplay, but when the consequences of failure mean a boatload of progress is lost, it just feels really punishing. But then, the game is very inconsistent with this too. Some missions do have generous checkpoints throughout the game, but others simply have none. It just throws the balance of the game out of whack. You can't tell if the designers were trying to make a punishing game or were just slapdash with their checkpoint placements. The lack of iframes and the checkpoints was the biggest thing that tripped me up back in 2011, and I guess I also just thought it was funny to play up the rage because my favorite YouTubers did it, and therefore I must copy their personality to the letter. Oh, to be 11 again. Anyway, these two issues are things I will admit to. If you don't like the game on those grounds or have issues with driving for minutes on end and all that, I get it. Nobody has to like the game as much as I do. I just look past those things to enjoy what I enjoy about the game. In fact, in the main platforming missions, I kinda like the harsh checkpoints. It gives the game a real tense vibe when you get to the end of a mission, but you can't get sloppy because a poorly timed jump could mean redoing the whole level. It adds some suspense to the experience, which I'd imagine was something they wanted given the more serious story and intimidating setting. Because of the way the combat is designed, it makes the metalheads a more consistent threat from start to finish. I just talked about how they come in all shapes and sizes throughout the game, and this gives them variety as enemies. But then they're also interesting villains from an art design and story perspective. When researching the first game, I saw them note in the artwork that they intentionally designed all the human characters with the long ears so that players would associate them instantly as someone on your side. And on the flip side, they designed all the lurker enemies from the basic grunt to the big guy and even the lurker shark to all share a massive underbite, making you instantly recognize that they're the enemy. These are the kinds of details you'd never think of while playing the game, but it has a subconscious effect on you while playing. Jak II takes that philosophy and uses it to its advantage. First, they designed the metalheads in a similar fashion. Every metalhead has solid yellow eyes and a giant shining skull gem that you collect upon defeating them. But they also wanted these guys to appear more menacing. Naughty Dog noted that no player would ever find the lurkers to be a threat in Jak I, you just see them and punch them. But in Jak II, it was all designed to be more challenging, like I've said. In terms of the story, the simple good guys and bad guys art design from Jak I is used to show how things have changed in the world. For example, one of your regular threats in this game is the Crimson Guard, but these are all normal humans led by completely normal humans. But the Lurkers are now a permanent underclass that you help escape slavery, coming to befriend a Lurker named Brooder, who even has evolved to walk on 2 feet. But then again, we're over 40 minutes into the video now, and if you haven't played the game, you don't even know what's going on and what I mean when I say the art design and characters show how the world has changed. So, allow me to fix that. Jak and Daxter find out 4 missions in that Baron Praxis is secretly giving barrels of eco to metalheads whom he claims he's fighting against. Torn tells Jak and Daxter to go meet Crew, an arms dealer in the city, to hopefully get on his good side and then learn why the Baron is doing this. The answer is that the metalheads need eco to live, and since Praxis knows he can't beat the metalheads, he cut a deal with them promising that he'd give them eco in secret, and in exchange, they'll attack the city just enough to warrant Praxis's continued rule. Praxis is an illegitimate leader. The guy who once fought off the metalheads was called Mar. He created Haven City and the shield wall that surrounds it to keep the metalheads from getting in. The true heir to Mar's throne is a kid whose whereabouts are currently unknown. As long as metalheads attack the city, Praxis can continue his unjust rule over Haven City. It turns out that this kid that the Underground's taking care of is Mar's heir, and they intend to put him back on the throne after they take down Baron Praxis. Jak and Daxter's missions do a lot of good in the Underground's cause, rising through the ranks of the group, to the point where the Shadow decides it's time to meet them after a mission in Deadtown where they stop the metalheads from destroying the sacred site, a place the metalheads seem to be drawn to. But for the duo, it's a shocking discovery that the sacred site is Samos' hut from the Precursor legacy, and that Deadtown is what's left of Sandover Village where they grew up, revealing that the rift ring the characters traveled through took them hundreds of years into the future. But things get scarier when it turns out that the Shadow is a younger version of Samos. The player might have been able to guess that they were in the future before this point, but when you see that a 15 years younger version of Samos is leading the Underground, now you really want to know how the story's going to play out. As J and D meet up with Kira, who works as a mechanic, and still don't know what happened to the old Samos they knew, setting up a lot of intrigue for the second act of the story. Now, while all this serious stuff is going on around Jak and Daxter, I still think Jak II is a funny game. Barring the humor that was obviously included to appeal to 13-year-old boys, I think that Jak II, in terms of comedic value, is actually funnier than Jak I. And like Jak I, the humor value comes from Daxter. In the first game, the humor was largely Daxter being snarky and rude to the various people you met during the game. But it's no doubt that the funniest scenes in the Precursor legacy were the ones that made Daxter the butt of the joke, which is why Samos was my favorite character in the game, as he'd roast Daxter every chance he got. But now, a lot more characters are doing that, and it's just very entertaining.
Hey! Tattooed wonder. How come we get all the crappy missions?
Because I don't like you.
Fair enough.
Even when other characters aren't involved, Daxter is consistently taking punishment in these cutscenes, like he's got some universal bad luck.
Hello, me.
Even when he tries turning the tables on Jak, he still gets the short end of the stick.
Wait a minute. I think this time you should go get the thing. Looks dodgy up there. Don't hurt yourself, Jak.
But I don't just enjoy the slapstick comedy of Daxter, I think Jak II has great character interactions between the cast. I can say that because Jak II has a core cast of characters. Jak I's gameplay-focused structure meant that all the people you saw in the world were just one-offs that gave you a power cell. Here you regularly interact with and take missions from the same people, and so they give each one a personality and a different motivation for being in the story. They also designed missions that affected the world you were playing in, continuing off of the Precursor legacy, contextualizing everything you do. But back to the characters, I just love the cast in this game. Like Sig, he's a total powerhouse that works for crew, but he's growing more uncomfortable with the kinds of jobs he has to do each day. So he starts off all tough, but he starts to like Jak and Daxter the more the game goes on. Or Torn, who used to be the lead of the Crimson Guard, but quit due to the cruelty displayed by Praxis. One of my favorite new characters is Vin, who's a total nervous wreck who's always fretting over the threat of the metalheads. And the scenes with him and Daxter are some of my favorites in the game.
Now, these plasmite bombs should do the trick. Drop one into each well, and the blast will do the rest.
Plasmate, huh? Cool. How does it work? Ah! I believe this is yours.
Hey, not my problem anymore.
No, really, I insist.
You're the hero.
No, Jak's the hero. Oops. Sorry. My bad.
I also love the cutscenes with Onin, a wise old woman in the bazaar who guides you when it comes to old Precursor legends. But she can only be understood through her interpreter, Pecker, who's another one of my favorite characters in the game with his shameless snark.
Why is Mars' tomb so important?
The fabled Precursor stone is rumored to sleep within the tomb, stupid! I added the stupid part.
Helps that every character is really well cast and equally well directed throughout the scenes. In the 90s, games having acting at all was a bar most companies were happy to meet, but Naughty Dog was always a step above that, as early as Crash II getting the talented Clancy Brown to play Dr. Neo Cortex. But fast forward 6 years and you have Jak II, where they got a lot of voice talent from the animation and voiceover world to bring their characters to life in their first truly cinematic game, such as Susan Eisenberg as Ashlyn, Phil LaMarr as Sig, or Clancy Brown once again as Baron Praxis. I highlighted them specifically because they were on Justice League, which aired on Cartoon Network at the time, so that gets special mention. But everyone here was talented and passionate about the project, and in awe over what Naughty Dog was achieving with this game. Although on the subject of Baron Praxis, I find him to be a pretty interesting character. We see several sides of him throughout the game. First as the guy we want revenge against for what he did to Jak, then as the ruthless dictator ruling the city. You see this side of him through these propaganda-spewing speakers placed throughout the city where he speaks to the people about how he's protecting them from the metalheads and these other lies. It's fun to stop and listen to these when you actively follow the story. You know he's trading eco with the metalheads, but here he is getting on the mic talking about how he's bravely putting a stop to their continued assault on the city.
This is your Baron. I am still in control. And I assure you, there's absolutely no metalheads in the city. Anyone who contradicts this fact will be shot. The current situation is merely an elaborate propaganda hoax, perpetrated by the outlawed underground militia, trying to subvert our laws and discredit those who protect you while you sleep. Pay no attention to this foolish hoax. There are no metalheads within 100 miles of this city.
But things get complex when you learn that he's not trading eco with the metalheads to help them. He wants to destroy them, he just doesn't have the power to do it. When talking to Errol, he says this.
He's toying with us! Let me lead an assault on the nest before it's too late! I can take him!
Patience, Commander. No one has ever penetrated the metalhead nest, you know that. I've seen what comes of such foolish plans.
Then when you reach the nest, you see it's covered in destroyed tanks and all that, meaning he did lead a direct attack on the nest and got beat really badly, and now he's been searching for a more powerful way to destroy them ever since, including the Dark Warrior program they tried on Jak. But that doesn't make him sympathetic. He's a terrible person doing evil things, selling lies to his adoring fans while also having nothing but contempt for them. However, it just so happens that your goals align with his in trying to stop the metalheads, which is a core part of the second act, the race for the Precursor Stone. The metalheads are the ancient enemy of the Precursors, and the metalhead leader feeds on the Precursor life energy that can be released from the Precursor stones. Mar used Haven City and the shield wall to safeguard the last Precursor stone from the metalheads. But now, nobody knows where the stone is. Jak and Daxter find it in the center of the city underneath the giant Mar statue. Funny how no one thought to look there. This is Mar's tomb as you get there with young Samos, Core, and the kid who opens the door to the tomb as he's Mar's heir. But since he's too young to face the trials inside, Jak rushes in, beginning one of my favorite levels, Mar's tomb, where you have to navigate through tough platforming as well as tests of memory and reflexes. But then, in a twist, Praxis swipes the Precursor stone from under you and tosses all your allies in jail. This is a cool moment for the story because we see different character motivations colliding and causing conflict. It turns out that Praxis knew they were about to make a move on the stone because Torn told him. Praxis threatened to kill Ashlyn, his own daughter, who Torn has affection for. Something the story set up as a sore subject earlier on.
Why didn't you tell me Ashlyn was Praxis' daughter? What's your connection with her?
That's none of your business.
So he put that before the cause of the underground. He's quickly forgiven as you must lead a daring rescue mission inside the fortress you escaped from at the beginning of the game, but getting out was much easier than getting back in as the guards have new armor that allows them to take more damage and you have to carefully use the jet board to grind through these laser cannons and electricity waves. It's an intense mission I always look forward to when playing the game. Once you rescue your teammates, you also find the older Samos trapped in the prison as well, as the two versions of Samos bicker back and forth like it's nobody's business.
We need to find the kid pronto. What are you talking about, old growth? The kid already opened the tomb. Our top priority should be to disrupt the Baron's forces. Oh, look who thinks they've sprouted. If you were half as wise as I am, you'd know that the proper course of action is to find the kid.
It then becomes an element of the story that Jak, Daxter, and the old Samos help the young Samos grow to get the sagely powers you know he's supposed to have after having played the first game. And then, Kira reveals to the old Samos alongside Jak and Daxter that she's rebuilt the Rift Rider they went through at the beginning, but is missing the Heart of Mar gem and a device called the Time Map, which are in Crew's hands. But he's currently working with Praxis to use the Precursor stone to build a bomb capable of destroying the metalheads that will also destroy the entire world in the process. So the third act is a quest to stop the stone from being used to create that bomb, with nobody knowing that all their efforts are in service of the true villain's machinations.
Core, what's going on?
I'm sure you know. Deep down in your darkest nightmares. We've met before, remember? Everything's going exactly as planned.
At the 11th hour, it's revealed that Core was the metalhead leader all along, disguised as a human to get into the city, join the underground, and help them undermine Praxis. Right before the reveal, the city goes on high alert as metalheads are attacking. A lot of things went into this happening, so I shall explain, as the reveal of Core's true identity allows players to recontextualize the story. Praxis thought he was playing the long game, deal with the metalheads, give them eco, and strike when they least expect it, but Core was playing an even longer game. He would take the Baron's eco and apply the pressure by saying he's at his wit's end with the slow eco deliveries. Meanwhile, he'd receive intel on Praxis by being a member of the Underground, like this part here.
And we overheard a secret meeting with the leader of the Metalheads.
You saw the Metalhead leader?
No, he was on some communicator, but we heard him talking with Baron Praxis.
The Baron is bribing the Metalheads with eco.
It will never be enough.
But the Baron's gonna double-cross him.
Is that so?
And like I said, by being a part of the Underground, he can further undermine Praxis, positioning himself to be there when major events happen like reaching Mar's tomb. While in the city, he learned how to shut down the shield wall, but needed the perfect moment to strike. Enter Crew. Crew worked alongside the Baron to develop the bomb that would destroy the metalheads with the Precursor stone, but he made a side deal with Core to provide the metalhead armies a way into the city that would go unnoticed, which happened at the end of the game as Sig claims he was sent into the underport by Crew to open an old gateway, and once he did, metalheads began their attack. In the attack on the city, the situation's given more stakes because Vin, one of my favorite characters in the game, gets killed off by an army of metalheads at the power station. With the shield wall down and the metalheads in the city, it's only a matter of time until Core finds the Precursor stone. And after being beaten by Metal Core, Praxis reveals to Jak that the stone was placed inside of a backup bomb before dying. He also mentions that he made Jak the way he is now with the intent for Jak to defeat the metalheads, showing how even in his final moments, Praxis is thinking that if Jak uses the stone to defeat Core, Praxis wins, technically, an ego to the very last. But that sets up the final mission where Jak and Daxter have to raid the metalhead nest.
Precursor stone, gun, nest.
Light her up, Padre!
Eat this!
That ought to wake him up.
Let's go take care of business.
What? You mean go in there? I'm right behind you.
Maybe it's just experience at this point, but I feel like the final level isn't really that spectacular. Gall and Maya's Citadel was the ultimate test of all the platforming skills you had gained up to that point in Jak 1, but here it's just some enemies blocking your path that you tear through before reaching Core, who has the kid as a hostage. The final part of his plan is to get the stone from Jak and Daxter and then have the kid open it, because the kid is Jak's younger self. Jak was born in the future with all these Precursor eco powers, but was sent to the past in the hopes he'd gain the skills to face Core when he was older. But with Jak having been experimented on with Dark Eco, he can't access the Precursor life force inside the stone like his younger self can. So now it's just an intense final boss between Jak and Core, where it's set up so that you start the battle as Dark Jak, but the second I transformed into him, I was immediately turned back to normal. I feel like that happens every time I get to this boss fight. But even without Dark Jak, I'd say Metal Core is pretty easy to defeat. You just gotta roll jump out of the way of his attacks and attack after he's done. And once you do, the day is saved. The Rift Ring is open and Kira's Rift Rider is ready. But old Samos claims that they need to use it to send young Jak and young Samos back to the past so that young Jak can grow up in a safer world. This turning the series into a time loop where the young Jak will always be rescued from Core by his older self and then sent back in time with a younger Samos where Jak grows up, the events of Jak 1 happen, and that causes this Jak to be sent into the future where he experiences the events of Jak 2 and then the cycle begins all over again. Although, the game quickly shows how confusing time travel can get.
I sure hope I built this replica right. I don't know if it...
It's perfect, Kira. This is the very machine we found, or will find later.
What? I just built this. After seeing the first one, I mean. It's based on what I remember from before.
Honey, the more you think about it, the more it hurts the head.
But on that note, the weirdest thing about this whole twist is something pretty minute. Jak had this uncle character in Jak 1, to the point where there was a quote from the uncle in the manual of Jak 1, not Samos, because they obviously hadn't thought this far ahead. That's just one of those things that you have to sweep under the rug to enjoy the overall story. Forget that guy ever existed, basically. And that's basically it for the story of Jak II. With all the major villains of the game dead, the heroes celebrate, remember those whose lives are lost, and look towards the future where they rebuild Haven City.
Jak, my boy, the future awaits.
And after having written 11,000 words on Jak II, I'm thinking that my point in all this might have been lost in the sauce long ago. So now that we're in the conclusion, I'll address the title of the video. Do I think Jak II is a perfect game? No, I guess not. I can list several flaws with it I've not mentioned thus far in the video. Like how I think it's weird how the story tells us that Jak is a symbol of hope for the people of the city, but then it's a core gameplay mechanic to steal from, bump into, and attack the citizens. I try not to hurt anyone when I play this game since that's just not my style, but to get around, you have to steal vehicles on the regular. Kind of a weird mismatch between the story and the gameplay. I never look forward to these missions with this clunky mech suit that come at the end of the game. I think these rail shooting segments are all boring, and I think things start getting padded when you have to rescue lurkers for a second time at the end of the game, but none of that really matters to me. Jak II is not perfect by any means, but for me, it comes together like no other game. It's such a satisfying mix of different elements that all work in isolation and putting them together in a fun way. It's unorthodox for sure. You probably won't like it if you're an adult playing it for the first time, but when it clicks, it really clicks. It's without question one of my favorite games to ever be made. I specifically called it a misunderstood masterpiece because, well, I obviously think that its writing and world design and gameplay are masterful, but then I just see this game written off as a dated product of its time so often. Made by a studio desperate to be one of the big kids, but too afraid to just let go of their cartoony roots. And I just don't see that in Jak II. I see a careful, all-in effort to make a next-generation game that, like its predecessor and the Crash games before it, sought to raise the bar on storytelling, voice acting, and animation in games, with cutting-edge world design. It's something I appreciate about Naughty Dog as a studio from 1996 all the way to today, and Jak II is no different. And that's basically all I gotta say on this one. I really did just say everything I ever could about this game in the last, hour, so I'm glad I got the chance to give this game a full review that I can be proud of, to say the least. Since I'm someone who loves Jak 1 and Jak 2, you might expect my thoughts on Jak 3 to be more of the same, since it seems you either love the whole series or just certain parts of it. However, Jak 3 is not the same to me. Despite having played Jak 3 several times in the near 20 years since its release back in 2004, my playthroughs of it as an adult have only made me look at this one as more of a disappointment compared to the first two. Now let me make myself clear. I don't hate Jak 3, I don't think it sucks or anything, it's just that I thought Jaks 1 and 2 came together in a really satisfying way. different ways between the two of them, but satisfying in both cases to where I enjoy replaying both of those games whenever I feel a revisit is in order. Jak 3 is one I'll replay because, well, I just replayed 1 and 2, might as well play 3. Then I walk away thinking, yeah, it's alright I guess, but it's a total mess when looking at it as a package. And that is, again, coming from someone who thought Jaks 1 and 2 were both excellent games in their own right. There isn't even that much history to go over in regards to the development of Jak 3, or at least in ways that are relevant to the discussion at hand. The history behind Jak 1 and 2 got me interested in exploring it because of how those stories of the evolving gaming culture impacted this series harder than any other, something so obvious because it changed so much from its first entry to its second. So I spent a long time in those videos exploring why Jak 1 was so well crafted only to be met with a less enthusiastic audience response than other games at the time, leading to Jak 2 being the way it was. For Jak 3, they knew they were sticking with the story, characters, and gameplay structure of Jak 2 and wanted to add on to the existing moveset for Jak to make it feel like a full sequel, and also improve upon the elements they got criticism from after releasing Jak 2. And that's what they did. Shipped the game just 1 year after Jak 2, compared to the 2 years of concentrated development that both Jak 1 and Jak 2 had gotten. Suffice it to say, I think this video will thankfully be much shorter than my video on Jak 2 last week, just focusing on Jak 3 as a whole, what I think it gets right, where I think it misses the mark, and giving my theory as to why that is. So let's not waste any more time and get into Jak 3. The story begins in the desert as Jak has been banished to the wasteland for life, as Daxter and Pecker protest.
This is an outrage! I am outraged beyond words! Although I do have something to say.
I always got a chuckle out of that. Daxter and Pecker decide to join Jak in his exile from Haven City as the game cuts between their march through the desert and flashbacks that show how we got to this point. Despite killing Core at the end of Jak 2, some of the Metalheads survived and are continuing their assault on the city, but the new Freedom League led by Jak and company have to fight on two fronts as the Metalheads have taken over one side of the city, but on the other, Crimson Guard deathbots are being mass-produced. So they're fighting a losing battle. Jak's name is being dragged through the mud as he's accused of being an accessory to letting the Metalheads into the city, which technically is true as Jak's missions for crew throughout Jak 2, while a means to an end to help the underground get intel, were also the things that ultimately allowed crew to get the Metalheads into the city to wreak havoc. So, by a vote from the Grand Council led by a guy named Count Viger, Jak is banished. But he's found by a group of wastelanders living in a sanctuary city called Spargus, ruled by Damus, Pecker being his new advisor, while Jak and Daxter have to prove themselves to the people of Spargus through combat and various desert expeditions, setting up the first act of Jak 3, where all the problems begin. The pacing in Jak 3 is really messy. You start the game off in a tutorial with basic platforming and combat, but then you have to ride a leaper lizard to catch 6 rats, play a minigame where you have to press the buttons that correspond with the ones on the screen, do tutorials on how to drive, race in the car, collect artifacts with that car, do a leaper lizard race with the local monks, battle desert metalheads in a vehicle, battle in the arena again, more content with leaper lizards, and then after an hour of gameplay, the player finally gets access to a mission with raw, unfiltered Jak and Daxter platforming, which was the thing you came to play. When in Jak 2, the first mission, yeah, it was a tutorial, but it felt like it was part of the experience as you escaped captivity. Then your first several missions are all core gameplay. The first mission in Jak 2 that I'd argue had nothing to do with core gameplay was when Jak and Daxter were first sent to the drill platform to destroy the Metalhead eggs, which didn't come up until an hour and 45 minutes into your playthrough. Even then, that mission still had combat and platforming. Like I said, the platforming action that I think defines J&D isn't playable until an hour into the game. Now, you could say that driving and such are the core gameplay mechanics of Jak 3, but in that case, I just think it's a downgrade from Jaks 1 and 2. While they did have minigames and driving, they were verifiably side portions of the game. Jak 3 blurs the line much more. Driving missions don't bother me, but then when it's back-to-back with leaper lizards and such, yeah, the first act of the game is really boring. Once you actually get into the main platforming content of Jak 3, I think it's enjoyable, but then after 2 good levels, you then do more of this stuff, like searching for survivors in the desert, driving this one large vehicle through a nearby metalhead nest, and the worst of all, shooting down targets with a turret. The first act just sets the stage poorly for Jak 3 because you're met with a host of minigames that obscure the focus of the game. And that's not to say it's all terrible. Like I said, I think the driving missions, as soon as you get access to a ride with guns that is, are fun. The Metalhead Hunt mission has these cool camera angles for when you get hit where the car goes flying. It's cool to see how in-depth the physics are for these desert vehicles because this is back when developers talked about designing elements like that from scratch.
It really gives us an opportunity to showcase the rigid body physics system that we developed. It's a very complicated simulation of physics. We have different gear ratios, different slip differentials, centers of gravity, horsepowers and torques, so it really is a realistic simulation on this dune buggy.
I always enjoyed using the Dune Hopper vehicle, which can jump really high into the air. Combined with the boost turbos you get, and you'll see some serious height and distance. I think all these vehicles are appealing from a design perspective too. I never really thought about this before playing Jak III for this video, but I'm pretty sure this game is the first time we ever see a vehicle move on wheels in the Jak series. We saw the lurkers use balloons in Jak I, while the zoomer the player used could hover a bit and had a propeller in front of it. But Jak II was much more futuristic with its flying cars and racing pods. It goes to show that the Wastelanders are making do with scraps, having less futuristic technology than Jak I while still being cool nonetheless. It's all pretty neat, but again, in the first hour of the game you only play as Jak to fight in the arena twice, otherwise it's a sea of things that were considered side content in the last two games. First impressions do matter, and one of the reasons why I don't go back to Jak III often is because I just remember the fact that the game's first 2 hours have a lot of side content tossed onto your lap when the first act should be the time to get me excited to keep playing more of the game. I do get that most of these are mechanics the player will use later in the game, so it's better to have a soft introduction earlier in the game before the big test. But I just think it could have been spaced out better because the first 2 hours really felt bogged down by all the minigames and tutorialization. It also isn't great because the story wants the return to Haven City to feel grand, after having spent a lot of time getting to know the people of Spargus City in the desert, the main thing the game was advertised around. However, by the time you begin the quest to re-enter the city, 2 hours into the game, I haven't done much in the way of fun gameplay, so my attitude is, instead of thinking, I have new friends now, I'm just like, yeah, take me back. You don't feel like you've been here long at all because I'm still getting into the game by the time you return to Haven City. But at least things get a lot better once you do. Starting with this long mission in the mines to get back into the city, a boss fight against a fully functioning Precursor robot, not like the modded one from Jak I's final boss. And then once you get topside, the content gets a lot more interesting. Making this as good a time as any to mention the fact that there are plenty of things I really like about Jak III. Those things being both major and minor. So let's look at them. In terms of quality of life features, I appreciate the fact that menus all scroll much faster in Jak III than they did in Jak II. This just improves the pace of the game if you plan on changing a setting or visiting the secrets menu from gameplay. Graphically, Jak III is working off the same standard as Jak II. Widescreen, progressive scan, no load screen, cutscene models, all the stuff you've come to expect from the Jak series is here and accounted for in Jak III. Although the game still suffers from the same performance issues that affected Jak II with screen tearing and frame drops. The latter of which might actually be worse in Jak III because of how much more action's on the screen. But I won't give the game too much crap because for PS2 standards, Jak III is loaded with content. I mean, you have 2 massive hub worlds, the sprawling wastelands and the ruins of Haven City. You don't see all of the city like you did in Jak II, but most of it is here. Pulling off all that with the dev time this game had while keeping the bar of the visuals as high as they did is a feat in and of itself. Now, when talking about the actual gameplay, Jak III improves upon elements from Jak II in numerous ways, first of which being the streamlined travel. The fact that players would spend a long time in Jak II just going from place to place is one of the biggest criticisms Naughty Dog took to heart when designing Jak III. So instead, the game places missions very close to one another so you don't have to spend several minutes going from place to place. For example, when in the port in the second act, all the missions are right here in this area, or they're in Haven Forest, which is like 90 seconds away from the port base. In addition to that, Jak II also had you complete a mission but then drive back to the quest giver so you can get another one. This still happens a few times in Jak III, but a lot of the time you'll finish a mission and then a character will get on the communicator and say the next mission is this, go do it. Like how Samos will tell you to go to Haven Forest for a mission, and then when that is done, Torn will say, Jinx is waiting for you outside for the next mission. This keeps the pace of the game going and contributes to why Jak III is shorter than Jak II by about an hour. I'd imagine designing the game like this also saved Naughty Dog time on the amount of cutscenes they have to animate, since half the missions in the game don't have a cutscene that triggers them, you just go do them. Jak III adds things that are quality additions. The jet board was great in Jak II, giving you a satisfying bit of extra speed with some visual flair thrown on top. It's pretty much exactly the same in Jak III, but you'd want to use it more in this game because of the fact that now you get this charged jump and a ground-based attack so you don't fear whipping it out in the middle of a platforming combat mission. Dark Jak was almost useless in Jak II because of the fact you had to drain the full bar of Dark Eco in order to tap into Dark Jak. It just made Dark Jak something you wouldn't want to use unless the situation seriously demanded it, like you were low on health in an enemy rush or a boss fight where your other weapons still do the job just fine. Jak III is a 100% improvement in this aspect because the transformation now works more like the Devil Trigger in Devil May Cry. The circular part of the gauge must be filled before you can be Dark Jak, but once you've transformed, you can transform back in an instant with the press of a button. So since the stakes don't have to be as high for you to use Dark Jak, his old moves like the bomb or the electricity spin are more useful. And I also got use out of the new moves like where you toss beams across the screen. To balance out Dark Jak, this game also allows you to tap into Light Eco to become Light Jak, the Yang to Dark Jak's Yin. Dark Jak allows you to tear through enemies with vicious attacks, and so Light Jak is built around defense and mobility as you learn various moves throughout the game, like the Light Jak Shield, the Time Stop, the Self Heal, and these Light Wings you use to reach places you couldn't otherwise. I actually don't use Light Jak much throughout my playthrough of this game, and that's not because there's anything wrong with the form itself. In a vacuum, these are all fine abilities, but, well, I guess I'll just save the rest of that thought for later and just stick to the things I like about Jak 3. The game massively improves upon the completion aspect. Jak 2 had over 200 Precursor orbs, but they didn't really contribute anything meaningful to the game. In Jak 3, there are 600 of the things, and while you still do use them for concept art, a level select, and behind-the-scenes material like Jak 2, they serve a much bigger role in the core gameplay loop as you find them all throughout the areas and can go to the secrets menu and spend them on things like new vehicles to drive in the desert with their own stats and weapons, nifty enhancements like Dark Jak's attacks homing in on enemies, the jet board going really fast in the desert, and best of all, upgrades to the functionality of your weapons like ammo efficiency and rate of fire increases and so on. With rewards tied to your gameplay, I feel more incentive to spend more time looking for Precursor orbs during the campaign, whether that be through the challenges that Jak 2 had, which you now spend Metalhead Skull Gems on, or just by doing jetboard exploration in the hub worlds that reward you with a surplus of orbs. Lastly, there's the soundtrack. I haven't really mentioned it up to this point, but I find the music in the Jak games to be pretty underrated. I highlighted the various moods that Josh Mansell pulled off in Jak 1, but this also carried over in Jak 2, even with its completely different direction. Jak 2 also had dynamic music where tracks would be altered if you were walking, fighting, shooting, driving, or jetboarding. That's not in Jak 3, but I figured I'd mention it since I forgot to do so in the Jak 2 video. The music in Jak 2 and 3 was done by Josh Mansell in the gameplay, but they also got a fellow named Larry Hopkins to score the cutscenes to add a more cinematic quality to the music, compared to games like Jak 1 where the cutscenes just keep playing level music in the background. And I'd say it was a successful effort. But as for Jak 3, the in-game music I find is memorable and atmospheric, so I often listen to it when doing other projects on my computer like thumbnails for videos and such. I've actually used Jak 3 music in several videos in the past because I find its vibe so easy to work into videos about other topics. I just used Subterranean, the theme of the forest and sewers, in my Resident Evil 2 video from a few months back to use as an example. But there are plenty of examples of tracks I really like listening to from Jak 3. I mentioned earlier that the platforming action in the second act of Jak 3 was an improvement over the start of the game, and it is. And I'd like to use that as a thing I enjoy about Jak 3, but that's where we get back into the problems. In terms of raw platforming, Jak 3 has a lot of fun moments. The first visit to the Precursor Temple in the desert sees you climbing up the tower by jumping between crumbling platforms and swinging between poles. With Jak's entire moveset still being in Jak 3, it's still fun to roll jump off ledges and land and high jump, or uppercut off ledges and transition into a spin. Jak just feels great to play as, and that has remained true throughout the entire trilogy. I can speak to numerous levels that are fun to play in, like the sewers, the forest, the war factory, the mines, and all the levels with platforming as a central element are satisfying to play from the mechanics alone. However, what I enjoyed a lot about Jak was the seamless platforming and combat mix. But I can't say I fully enjoy the main levels and missions of Jak 3 because this game is one of the most broken combat systems I've ever experienced. Jak 2 had only 4 weapons, nothing compared to the roster you'd see from its sister series Ratchet and Clank, however less is more in this case. I thought Jak's 4 guns in Jak 2 were really well balanced around each other for reasons I stated in my video on that game. In Jak 3, the Scattergun, the Blaster, the Vulcan Fury, and the Peacemaker are all still in this game and work the same as they did in 2, so in theory the balance should still be intact. But things get screwed up the moment Jak 3 introduces additional modes upon the 4 weapons you have. Each of the 4 weapons will receive 2 new modes before the game is over, giving the game a total of 12 guns. I get it, they wanted to go big or go home. But if you're going to have all these weapons, you have to design enemies around that fact. You have to design the weapons to work in tandem, but they didn't. The first upgrade to the Blaster alone breaks the game. You get the Beam Reflexor early on, which causes the blaster shots to ricochet off of walls. This makes it so that in combat you barely have to try with this thing equipped. You just jump, spin, and shoot the Beam Reflexor and watch the sparks fly. In the arena, you can see that I'm barely doing anything, and yet the enemy total is drastically going down. This even dampens platforming levels. In the mines, you're supposed to shoot these targets to give the dynamite a path to reach the door while under a time limit, but with the Beam Reflexor, the shots may just travel so far all over the screen that it will hit all the targets after a few tries, ending the mission way before it was actually supposed to end. This strat gets people killed in Jak II, but in Jak III it truly allows the combat to almost play itself. One weapon this OP is bad enough, but then you get the Gyro Burster, which, upon being fired, will send a mini UFO into the air that spreads blaster shots all over the screen with laser-like precision in hitting the enemies. When using the Gyro Burster and the Beam Reflexor together, no combat scenario stands a chance against you. Another utterly broken weapon is the Plasmite RPG, the third level for the Scattergun. This one tosses a grenade in front of you that decimates any enemy it comes into contact with, including the shields of the ultra-powerful Darkmakers you fight at the end of the game. You get the Plasmite RPG before the first level of the Peacemaker, but it makes the Peacemaker completely obsolete because it doesn't need to be charged up and tears through enemies just the same, with an almost identical amount of shots, but with much more frequent ammo drops because red ammo is never in short supply compared to dark ammo. The same issue applies to the Blaster's upgraded weapons. Yellow ammo is so common that abusing the Beam Reflexor is very easy to do. But even if you run out of ammo for the Scattergun or the Blaster, it's no problem. Just grab the Arc Wielder, which spews electricity all over the screen, or the Needle Laser, which homes in on every enemy. Out of that too? Well, you still have the Peacemaker and its upgrades, the Mass Inverter, which reverses gravity, making every enemy in its range utterly helpless, or the Supernova, which is just a screen nuke. And if that wasn't enough for you, you still have Dark Jak and Light Jak at your disposal. The perfect example of how Jak III is just not well balanced can be seen in the Stadium Ruins level. I ran in with the Plasmite RPG and the Gyro Burster and blew every enemy away before they knew what hit them. Then I tried it again with the Vulcan Fury weapons and did the same thing. Then I tried it with Light Jak, who, I remind, can make himself completely impervious to damage, while also having the power to heal and slow down time. Then turning into Dark Jak and unleashing his screen nuke powers. Jak III is just not a challenging game, that's because the player is showered in a sea of ultra-powerful killing machines. As I said, the enemies are not designed with this in mind because they don't feel like a threat. This can be satisfying, like the War Factory level where you just tear through all the enemies in this one-man raid, and then the part at the end where you find this vehicle to tear through the doors was a nice cherry on top of a good level. But I don't want to feel this powerful throughout the entire game. Even in the third act when the Darkmakers reach the Earth, the player can't be stopped. The Plasmite RPG will tear away their shields, Dark Jak will destroy them in no time, and so will all your other options. I get that they got a lot of heat for Jak II being as difficult as it was, but this is a comedic overreaction. I don't even mind that Jak III has way more checkpoints than Jak II. In fact, if they left it at that, it would have been a quality improvement in the difficulty balancing since losing all your progress in a mission for the tiniest slip-up was too far. But really, it's just the stale combat that does Jak III in for me. You have so many weapons of mass destruction in your arsenal that combat is not fun to play anymore. I never die from a combat situation in Jak III because the enemies stand no chance against me, and even when it gets dicey, I can heal all my health with Light Jak. Even with all my experience, an enemy rush in Jak II still manages to be tense to me because you have to play your cards right to succeed in that game, but not Jak III. This is definitely one of the most unbalanced combat systems skewed in the player's favor I have ever seen. It just makes it difficult to enjoy what's worth enjoying in the game when its systems are not carefully considered. I enjoyed the second act the most because it was the part where the game focused on combat and platforming for several missions straight. Even if the combat isn't good in Jak III, it's still one of the better parts of the game. But then, in the final hours of gameplay, the game just goes off the rails with the minigames. Like raiding the Metalhead Nest a second time with Sig in this giant tank, followed by a mission where you shoot the cannon in that tank while Sig drives, aiming at metalheads for no lie, 5 minutes straight of just holding down the shoot button. There's no overheating mechanic or anything, you just point and shoot at the targets that move very slowly when there are only like 2 or 3 things you need to shoot on screen at once. It goes on for an eternity. One of the main attractions for the endgame is the raid on the KG War Factory that hangs in the sky. And to get there, you need to grab something from the power station where Daxter must enter a computer and play this Pac-Man type game. It's not full-on Pac-Man, but it's clearly evoking that imagery. And you know, some kind of homage to an older era of game could be interesting in a game that knows what it's trying to do, like, say, the Quark 2D platforming levels of Ratchet & Clank 3, but when Jak III is forcing the players through this entourage of completely random game modes and mechanics that have nothing to do with Jak and Daxter, this just becomes part of the white noise. Defending Spargus from the Darkmakers isn't an all-out assault on the enemies. Of course not, it's a rail-shooting minigame that goes on for several minutes. Jak linking up with the Darkmaker ship for the first time sees you taking control of the mech suit from Jak II that I already didn't like, as you, with no checkpoints, must reach the end of this hall. I spent almost 10 minutes on that because I died towards the end. After that, you have to raid Errol's ground base, and to do that, you must do another rail shooting minigame protecting Torn and his bombs that last for 6 minutes, where you just point and hold down the shoot button. And this really wears me down. It's just so boring, especially after all these other missions. And while I'm on this one, Sig just appears in this mission out of nowhere. Ashlyn tells Jak and Daxter they need to defend Torn and Jinx, and then in the mission, Sig is just there too with no explanation, as he had nothing to do with the plot in Haven City before this point, and really doesn't after this mission either. All he does in this mission is hand you the supernova gun, which Jinx could have easily done. Or just not have Jinx and have Sig instead. Things like this are the only things catching my mind, because otherwise the gameplay is just this for 6 minutes. Things don't just happen in the Jak and Daxter games for no reason. It's been a staple of the series since the first game, so yeah, that's another thing against Jak 3. Of course, I'm not saying you play all these minigames back to back, but we already went over the fact that Jak 3's combat greatly brings down the main gameplay, especially this late in the game where you have most of the weapons. So by the end, I'm just really bored with the game. And it doesn't help that the last nail in the coffin that cements Jak 3 as the worst game in the trilogy is the fact that the story is a mess. For starters, the plot is very unfocused. At the beginning of the video, I said you arrived in Spargus and you're getting to meet these new faces, and then you're tossed back into Haven City to continue the conflict. So therefore, new characters like Cleaver just don't leave much of an impression. He doesn't get any screen time besides being the reason you have to go on pointless missions. He doesn't get the screen time to be anything else. But dividing up the screen time is a game-wide issue. By the end of Jak II, the core cast of characters is pretty large, and now we add a few extra ones to the roster. Every character in Jak II played a role in the overall story, and it came together in a satisfying way. In Jak 3, you can't just not have Kira, for example, be in the game without people wondering why she wasn't in the game. But because of that, you have the flip side problem of Kira just being there, doing and saying almost nothing from start to finish. Onan is another example of a character who served a purpose in Jak 2 who's just there in Jak 3. Hell, I'd even say Sig doesn't add anything to the story either. We learned that he was a spy in Jak 2 trying to find Damus' son but got caught up in working for Crew, but as a character his role in the story is often confusing. Like I said, he just shows up at one of the last missions with no prior context whatsoever. So first you have the fact that there are too many characters with not enough to do in the plot, just dropping in and out of the story as they please, but then we just don't get enough development for the actual important stuff. I like Damus, he's kind of a hard case at first, but warms up to Jak as the game goes on. I just think it's a little forced that they make sure to mention that Jak doesn't know his dad, something that never came up before this point, despite it being a clearly sore subject. And then later it's mentioned that Damus lost his son in Haven City. I'm thinking the bond between Jak and Damus would have been better if he was allowed more screen time, but that's the cost of the game going so quickly between Spargus and Haven City. One of the biggest issues I have with this plot is how there's no clear villain for the first 3 hours or so of the game. Count Vigor banishes Jak to the Wasteland, but this guy's no main villain. He doesn't have an army or powers or anything. So it doesn't feel like a threat, especially since he's getting mocked in so many cutscenes.
You're washed up, Vegan!
Vigor! It's Vigor, you idiot!
But then it's revealed that Errol is the main antagonist of Jak 3, and this always felt like such an ass pull. Errol was a rival to Jak in Jak 2, something I barely went into last time, but he died at the end of the game by driving himself into barrels of dark eco in an attempt to kill Jak. But now he got revived as a cyborg and is a super hammy Metal Gear boss who's controlling the metalheads and the KG robots and is communicating with the Dark Makers and is leading the charge in their attack on Earth? I say it as a question because I really have no idea what's going on in the plot half the time. It just confuses me more than anything else, especially since Errol and Vigor have nothing to do with each other. Vigor was the one who attacked the palace at the beginning of the game to gain access to something in the catacombs to stop the Dark Makers himself, but Errol is the one instigating the war. It's not like Jak 2 where you're caught between two warring factions you have to fight against, it's just Vigor's a guy who needs to be stopped and Errol's up to something completely different. But luckily, Vigor's stopped pretty easily. In one of the weirdest scenes in the game, Ashlyn just dissolves the council that got Jak banished.
Count Vigor, I hereby dissolve the city council and strip you of your title, command, and all privileges. Now get out of my sight.
But at the beginning of the game, she said that couldn't be done. I guess she just hadn't thought of firing the council yet. The writing of this game just feels like it's being made up on the spot, when the previous game just felt so tightly written to build up to the grandest moments. To close this book, I think one of the worst elements of the plot is how inconsistent the tone is in Jak 3. I said last time that I found Jak 1 and 2 to both be funny games in terms of witty dialogue and physical humor, but Jak 3 made a much more concerted effort to have this Ratchet and Clank styled humor, and I think it's just not that funny. There are some good lines and moments in Jak 3, but largely it's all going in one ear and out the other when I replay this game. Then, serious moments don't get much time in the sun either. Like when Jak refuses to return to Haven City with Ashlyn, he then just does the mission immediately after this. Okay, he got his mind changed with Ashlyn's last words to him, maybe, but it just feels rushed. No greater example of tonal whiplash in Jak 3 than the two most important cutscenes in the game. Damus comes to Jak's rescue when the duo is cornered by some Darkmaker machines, and we get the final mission with him after a whole game of building their relationship up. But after the task is accomplished, the car gets hit by a bomb that flips it over and mortally wounds Damus as he asks Jak to find his son, Mar, the youngest heir in the House of Mar, as Damus himself was once the leader of Haven City but was betrayed and banished by Praxis, leading to Jak II's status quo. Jak immediately realizes that he is Damus' son, and getting separated from Damus is how Jak's younger self came to be in the care of the Underground in Jak II. But before Jak can say anything, Damus dies, and Count Vigor, who just appears out of nowhere, reveals that he knew it all along and wanted to tap into Jak's special powers for himself before Jak got found by the Shadow, and mocking that Damus never knew Jak was his son, getting Jak and Daxter fired up for a confrontation with Vigor. But of course, we first have to play a minigame, and then we go from this dramatic death scene to the reveal that the Precursors are actually Otzels, the species Daxter is. A scene played for laughs, which I really don't care about either way. It's not like finding out who the Precursors were mattered to me in the previous games, but they chose to make this reveal as comedic as possible, with full-on fourth-wall breaking gags, and again, Ratchet-styled humor about how they should have gone with a backup hero. It's just not that funny to me. It's nice that they tried to tie the whole trilogy together by explaining that since they made Eco, it contains their essence, which is why Daxter turned into one of them in Jak 1. But the real problem is that this comedic apex of the story is right next to the dramatic apex of the plot. The writing in this game is just all over the place, setting up for a climax that just doesn't land the way it's supposed to. I, for starters, don't care about the Darkmakers. They're former precursors who got corrupted by Dark Eco and now destroy planets. Will Earth be next? No way, Jak's arsenal is far too loaded for that to happen. They can't touch me, so I'm not afraid of them. And then Errol is the final boss, this character who still, even by the finale, just feels like such a tacked-on afterthought that you're still wondering why they even decided to bring him back, of all characters, to be the climactic final enemy of the Jak trilogy. It doesn't help that the first part of the final boss is really annoying as you need to shoot these targets on this terraformer's legs, but whenever you get down to the last one, it always takes forever to shoot it. Then the second phase is laughably broken in your favor, like all the other combat scenarios in the game. But hey, at least this shot of Jak and Daxter walking through the sand is pretty cool. And I almost forgot about that. This game rewrote the fact that Kira was Jak's love interest in favor of Ashlyn, who was presumed to be Torrens before. So yeah, that was a weird thing they did in Jak 3 that came out of nowhere and goes nowhere as well. But then we get the ending where Daxter finally gets that pair of pants he's been waiting for, and the Precursors invite Jak on a tour of the universe, where it's then implied that Jak was the real Mar, his own ancestor, and created Haven City and all that, and then went back in time to this very moment. But I choose not to think that's the case, because making Jak the real Mar just makes him a little too important for my liking, but that's just me.
Wait, Jak is Mar? The Mar?
I just assumed that he changed his mind and pulled a Batman exit and appears here, just in time for the ending shot.
I couldn't leave you, Dax. With all our adventures ahead, you wouldn't last a second without me.
Ah, what a team we are!
Yeah, well, the next adventure, I call the shots. Put it in, partner. Ah! Psych! Oh yeah, life is good.
Jak 3 is an interesting game to me. After all the complaining I just did, I might as well rip the band-aid off and say I don't hate Jak 3. It's like I said at the beginning, it's not some unplayable mess. Not that this is where the bar should be, I'm just saying. It didn't kill the series or some melodramatic line like that. It's a finished, polished product with all the same elements I enjoy from the previous games. I just think Jak 3, in so many ways, did not live up to its potential. The game just doesn't feel inspired to me. It obviously had its inspirations like Mad Max or this Rockstar game called Smuggler's Run on PS2. However, my point is that Jak 1 and 2 had a history to them that I thought was worth exploring. The things that inspired those games, the culture of the video game industry that affected those two titles. To me, Jak 3 just feels like Jak 2, but with more stuff in it, made with the intent to address the issues people had with that game. It's not a terrible goal, I understand, it's just that in execution it makes Jak 3 feel kinda bland, being pulled in too many different directions. It wants to be the epic finale of the Jak trilogy, and it also wants to be this funny game, and also wants to have all these crazy weapons and powers, but with the game not doing the work to make the enemies scale with your weapons, it makes the combat a breeze, and with writing this all over the place, it fails at almost everything it sets out to do. Tossed in a bunch of minigames, and that's Jak 3. I don't think it sucks, I just think it really isn't that great either. I can play this any old day of the week if I felt so inclined. It's just one of those games where I can play it, it's just that I'd prefer not to. Like I'm Bartleby the fucking Scrivener over here. It's a C-tier game to me, which, as I defined in a previous video, is a game that is okay at the end of the day, just not one you'd be clamoring to revisit. A lot of folks in the audience really love Jak 3, and that's fine, I get it. It's just that I think the game could have been a lot better if different choices were made in regards to its focus and difficulty design. I mentioned at the beginning that there wasn't much to tell about the history and context of Jak 3, but I merely meant that as not much that would matter for my opinion on the game at the start of the video. Jak 3 launched in the fall of 2004, and that game was the last one Naughty Dog developed while the co-founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin worked at the studio. Jak 3's development cycle being their opportunity to smoothly transition between that old leadership and the one we know today. While developing Jak 3, the studio already knew that for PlayStation 3 they were going to fully embrace what the industry is most interested in, games starring real humans using real weapons. That ended up being Uncharted: Drake's Fortune, which was released in 2007, something I can go way more in depth on when I do an Uncharted retrospective in the near future. However, I bring it up now because as a buffer between games, Naughty Dog did one last game on PlayStation 2, an epilogue to the Jak series, Jak X Combat Racing. The first game the studio had released completely without its founders in 2005, but Jak X was going to be a smaller title, reusing assets from previous games and just building a racing title with those assets. And if there's one thing Jak had consistently had throughout the trilogy, it was vehicles.
If there's one thing I can do, it's race.
So it was a natural fit, and not something the studio was unfamiliar with, having capped off their Crash run on PS1 with Crash Team Racing in 1999. Despite all that, and my immense nostalgia for the Jak series, I never played this game as a kid. I played all the Sly, Ratchet, and every other Jak game when I was a kid, but this one consistently evaded me. I always thought of it as a I'll get it eventually kind of game, but never did. Always had my eyes caught on some other game. The one time I could have gotten it, actually, my uncle was like, "This is rated T. I'm not buying this." Good on him for that level of due diligence when buying a game for a 6-year-old or whatever the hell I was at the time. But hey, I did walk out of that store with Tie 3 on Game Boy Advance though. Maybe that series is worth a retrospective someday. It's been years since I played any of those. Anyway, I never got around to playing Jak X Combat Racing until 2012, which of course was a hot minute ago now compared to how old the game was in 2012, but I already talked about feeling old in the Jak II video, so I'll just get to the point. Do I like Jak X, even though I didn't play it back when it was hot off the presses? Well, the title of the video says all. I think this game is fantastic, and dare I say, is way better than Jak 3. That's in a genre I don't even play that much of. Games where the multiplayer component is the most important one are games I tend to lose interest in quickly. So fighting games and racing games, while being things I have experience with, it's not particularly vast because without a strong single player campaign, I just don't feel the incentive to keep coming back and playing more of the game. Just look at Crash Team Racing, which I mentioned a few moments ago. My review of that game a few years ago was the first time I played it, and it was also the last time. I don't think these games are bad, I just know they aren't for me. So if one of those games does manage to get its hooks in me, that's how I know I've got a real winner on my hands. One of the quickest ways you can get me into a game is if that game has a sick sense of style. Crash Team Racing took all the elements of and lessons learned from the Crash trilogy into a racing game that suited that brand that could stand toe-to-toe with Mario Kart or Diddy Kong Racing. Jak X did the same thing, looking at the best parts of the Jak series' personality and coming up with a racing game to suit that. This game isn't trying to be the PS2's Mario Kart Double Dash. It's full-on F-Zero meets Twisted Metal combined with the Jak world and iconography, creating this deadly racing game, where, as the title shows, you don't just race, it's full-on fight-to-the-death combat racing. So to go along with that hardcore racing identity, the game has this metal music to suit any track it plays as you blast your way through the opposition and just barely outrun their attacks yourself. I said I love the soundtracks in the Jak trilogy, but this music is easily the best one in the series, one I listen to frequently when doing projects on my computer and I'm in need of some background noise. Just a soundtrack that I think is a genuinely good listen if you're someone who's into that intense mid-2000s kind of stuff. So what's going on in this Jak X game? Well, in short, Jak and friends have been invited by Crew's daughter, Rain, to hear his last will, Crew being a crime lord that Jak and Daxter left for dead in Jak II. A hologram of Crew boldly proclaims that the party gathered here today will race for him in the Crash City Grand Championship, and to make sure they do it, the drink they all toasted over was poison, and the only way to get the antidote is by racing. But of course, it's not that simple. The competition is run by the Mizo crime syndicate, so our heroes have to face their own inevitable doom while also competing against dangerous criminals who also want them dead for upsetting the order of the criminal underworld in Crash City. The story serves its purpose for getting the characters racing, and I do mean almost all of them. In the story mode, you only play as Jak, with Daxter flailing about on top of your vehicle, but in the multiplayer, you get to play as a whole host of characters from the Jak series, all given new attire fit for racing, such as Ashlyn, Torn, Sig, Kira, Cleaver, and new characters from Jak X like the sports commentator, GT Blitz, or Jak's new racing rivals like UR86 or Razor. By visiting the secrets menu, you can unlock other characters as well. If your memory card has a save file on it for Jak 1, 2, and 3, you get to play as Jak from those games, and if your card has a save file for Ratchet Deadlocked on it, then you get to play as Ratchet from that game with new audio recorded from his voice actor for this game. At the time of Jak X's development, there was also a Daxter spin-off game in the works for the PlayStation Portable, so Jak X built in a bunch of characters from that game to be playable in this game by connecting your PSP. With all these characters unlocked, I'd say this is a pretty stacked roster full of fan favorites, although it was a big missed opportunity to not have Samos as a playable character. I mean, he's the funniest character in the series, and it would have been a riot to unlock him and blow Jak and Torn to bits with rockets and all that. But that's just one glaring omission from Jak X's roster. Otherwise, I think it's great that we get to take all these characters we know out on the track in this one. It's a nice epilogue to Naughty Dog's time with the series. One of the biggest things the team wanted to achieve with Jak X was giving the player an assortment of ways to customize their vehicles. Throughout the story, you unlock more and more race cars to work with, and also new hoods, new side panels, front and rear fenders, wheels and trunks that you can mix and match however you see fit. These don't have any strategic advantage, it's just giving the cars different designs and styles that allows players to make vehicles to their preference. You can even ride with no plating whatsoever. What does impact the play experience is the game allowing you to spend your currency from completed missions on upgrading your car of choice's stats, such as its armor, its boost gauge, the acceleration, and the top speed, allowing the rides you like the best to reach their full potential. I'm a sucker for games that allow the players to customize cosmetics, and so I just get a lot of reward out of mixing and matching the different parts, but especially got reward out of the paint job feature. Each ride can be given a body color and a stripe color. I tried cladding my vehicle in Jay's Review's colors, but that looked completely hideous without the white and black to contrast with the blue and green, so instead I defaulted to my usual favorites, black and green, black and blue, black and red, but then mixed it up. Silver and orange, silver and red, using black as a stripe instead of a body color, and so on. I was genuinely swapping paint jobs with almost every race I did, and with a color wheel this extensive, can you blame me? It sparks my imagination. When actually pulling up to the track, it's immediately obvious as to how much more fun the cars are to control in this game compared to Jak III. In that game, the physics on each vehicle was definitely interesting to see as your car would interact with the bumpy terrain of the wasteland, but it's not handling that's particularly satisfying when trying to race. So Jak X improved that by making the turns feel smoother and the track straighter in design. And for ones that aren't, I thought the skid turns were really responsive, although I always seem to struggle with these tube tunnels in the sewers. This goes for each of your vehicles. The first 3 cups of the game all have their own vehicles, with each of them being a certain type. You have all-around vehicles that have a standard armor and speed, bulkier vehicles that are best used in the combat maps, smaller cars that are the fastest but the weakest in terms of health, and hybrid cars that aren't as efficient in either of the previous 2 advantages as the specialized vehicles, but is good with both. In regards to combat and other things worth noting about the mechanics, I love how they made sure to tie each weapon variety to a type of eco and how they were used in Jak 1. This is also something I liked about the morph gun in Jak 2 and 3. It just helps making the whole series feel like it's a part of the same world. Eco is still what everything is built from. Green eco is how you repair damage to your car on the track, your health bar being displayed in the bottom left. This is the most rare pickup of the bunch, and so when you see one you instantly want to grab it so you can tank more damage from incoming attacks. Blue eco is where your boost gauge comes from as you refill with pickups on the track. But the game also encourages you to jump off of ramps for maximum airtime and to perform tight skid turns because the longer you hold those, they'll refill your boost gauge, keeping you in the front of the pile. By defeating enemies, you collect Dark Eco, and when that gauge is filled, all your attacks will become stronger, your boost gauge will be filled up to the max, and so on. But on the note of the attacks, you use Yellow Eco weapons to attack your foes in front of you, whether that be bombs, missiles, bullets, or a Peacemaker shot, and Red Eco weapons being used for defense, like a mine that you leave behind or a shield that you raise around your vehicle. I think the weapons are all pretty cool in Jak X, I just don't think they're balanced the best, which is the only mechanical problem I can really bring up. The offensive weapons are super powerful, capable of blowing up a vehicle within a few shots. However, you don't get that many defensive weapons in response. For example, you'll get 2 missile shots, which fire 2 missiles each. When it locks onto you, you can deploy a defensive weapon like a mine to deflect the attack, but you only get 1 mine, so you'll have to just tank the damage on the second set of missiles that player has. If you have a full health bar, you won't die from this, but I do feel like it's cheap that there's nothing I can do to avoid damage in this instance. Maybe it would be unbalanced if you had 2 mines to block all the missiles, but maybe skilled players could just skid turn at the right angle to dodge missiles and then I'd be fine with it. But as it stands, I think the way the game is balanced makes red eco's use hard to determine. The characters encourage you to use eco the second you get it, which makes sense. For example, leaving behind a drone that blasts the drivers who pass by it will further damage the enemies behind you, making it harder for them to catch up and more difficult to use weapons on you. But since I could be attacked at any moment, I try to hoard my red eco weapons for as long as possible to make sure I can use it to deflect incoming attacks. But the issue only gets worse when the players in the back get access to the Peacemaker, which locks in on the player in first place and kills them instantly. Your only hope in avoiding this is having a shield raised. The Peacemaker will be deflected by the shield, which is, from my experience, the rarest defensive drop in the game. I just don't like mechanics like the Peacemaker, where I'll be leading the pack for most of the race, but at the end it can be stolen from me by a weapon I literally cannot dodge. I just don't think that's fair. Although I think this issue is pretty minor. It's just something that irks me every now and again while racing, as opposed to a serious problem. Lots of racing games have items that players in the back use to wreck players in the front, but I'm just saying that's my preference to not have it that way if I were designing the game. But then that just brings up the conversation about how accessible a game is if less skilled players will just get utterly wrecked by people who have played it for longer. It's a whole thing. So from a certain point of view, it makes sense to design it like that. Jak X is a title with a lot of variety. The standard racing is what you'll do most with a certain number of laps around the track. Shorter tracks will have up to 5 laps like the races in Jak II, and longer tracks will have 2 laps, making it so that each track gets a roughly equal amount of playtime. But then there are a whole host of other modes that take place on these tracks, such as death races, where the player has to blast a certain number of drone cars under a time limit in order to get the gold medal. Freeze rallies, where you need to reach the goal under a strict time limit, and so you need to strategically hit these time-stopping items to stop the clock for however long that time lasts, ranging from 2 seconds to the rare 10-second time stop. There are power cell races, where you grab a power cell and need to boost continuously until the power cell is charged to 100%, where it will then attack another racer. Once a power cell is fully charged up, you'll get a defensive item to block any power cell coming towards you. I actually think this is my favorite mode in the game, as it's really satisfying to see a power cell coming for you and just barely get to 100% in time and block that attack. And it feels equally crushing to almost get a power cell charged up but then get hit right before it happens. By the end, the racer with the highest amount of power cells charged up wins. The only standard race mode that I don't like would be Rush Hour. Players must face off against an onslaught of cars coming your way and you must slam into them for points. Green ones are worth 1 point, blue ones are worth 2, and red ones do damage to your vehicle. It's simple in concept, but whenever I play it, I can never get a flow going because I'm just bouncing all over the place trying to get my bearings. It's better done with the bigger rides, but that doesn't really fix the core issue here. To mix it up, every now and again you get a break from the core racing and go to these big combat maps. Here you do standard death matches where you try to get the most kills in the time limit, but then they also give variety to these maps too. Some missions testing which racer can hunt the most raptors in the time limit, who can get the most artifacts, and my favorite, capture the power cell. Racers are divided into 2 teams, and a power cell will spawn in the area, and your goal is to grab that power cell and bring it back to your base before getting blown up by the other team, giving them the chance to nab the power cell and bring it back to their base, as you then need to destroy them before they can make it. It's a really fun mode and feels pretty competitive, even when playing against CPUs. So this game has all these different tracks and modes and all that, so I think it's worth mentioning that because the game is centered around segmented racing levels, this game features loading screens. They're over fairly quickly and were pretty much inevitable, unless Naughty Dog wanted to make an open-world racing game. But since the series had prided itself on not putting the words loading on the screen, I figured I'd mention that, since it's something that took me by surprise when starting up Jak X for this video. Another thing Jak X does differently from previous games on a technical level will be how they handled the cutscenes. Jaks 1 through 3 all had the cutscenes play out in-engine, but Jak X's cutscenes were pre-rendered. When playing the game at the native resolution, it's harder to spot, but if you try cleaning them up, the artifacts are pretty easy to see. I never knew why they did this prior to making the video, but luckily, the game itself informs us as to why. Like Jak 3, you can unlock animators' commentary on each of the cutscenes, and in the scene where Jak and company toast to Crew's will, it is explained.
Now, this scene is also interesting because this is really the first scene where we took advantage of the fact that we were essentially screenshot capturing all of the scenes instead of playing them back in real time. And this enabled us to do a hologram effect that pretty much would have been impossible to do, or at least not look nearly as cool in real time on the PlayStation 2. So Essentially, this is seen as composited, much like a film special effect would be composited. What we had to do was create two separate scenes. One scene that had all of the characters except crew in it, and then another scene that had just crew in it against a purple-black background. And what we were able to do is extract crew from the purple background and then superimpose him over the scene that you see here.
So yeah, in order to pull off the effects they did, like Crew's hologram, or I'm imagining the GT show overlay, it was necessary to pre-render the scenes and superimpose elements like that. Little tidbits like that are why I wish every game had behind-the-scenes material. I also appreciate them including a video of the actors reading the lines for the first scene. It really allows you to appreciate how into it voice actors get as they move their arms and make facial expressions while reading the lines that you never see because you only hear their voices. It just reminds me of how I'm doing the same thing right now, and you just can't see it. But anyway, in gameplay, Jak X still maintains a high bar of presentation. I mean, look at these environments. For racing game standards, vistas, lighting effects, and backdrops like this were a rarity on PlayStation 2. But this game pulled it off at these high speeds. I love going in the first person mode with the select button, as you can then see how wide the tracks are as you blaze by with the ground view. I dare not imagine what it would be like playing this in VR. Even this late in the generation, Jak X does have a technical improvement from the previous games. All the PS2 Jak games allow you to display them in 16:9, but Jak X was the first one to have a true, authentic widescreen display. I mean that if you pick 4:3 in the previous games, you'll see the image how it would appear on a CRT, but if you pick 16:9 in the event your display in the early 2000s supported that, the first 3 Jak games, as well as many other games with a 16:9 display mode at the time, would simply crop the image in the top and bottom to fill the screen horizontally. Personally, I don't mind. I can't think of a game where this ever damaged my playing experience, but it's worth noting as some don't prefer to lose out on total visibility just to fill the screen. I'm just used to seeing the Jak trilogy like this, so it's weird to play in 4:3. But Jak X does what you'd hope to see in a widescreen setting, and actually shows more of the image on the left and right of the screen than it would have in 4:3. This is what remasters like the Ratchet & Clank HD Collection or the Sly HD Collection had done with those games. The Jak HD Collection just stuck with the cropped mode as the default, if you were curious. One of the best things about the newly released fan-made Jak 1 PC port is that it has true widescreen, another reason why it's the best version to exist. Looking forward to seeing how Jak 2 and 3 come together in the end. I say that because the team behind it have confirmed they're doing the full trilogy, but Jak X is still up in the air. I hope it does happen because Jak X never got remastered like the trilogy did in 2012. Maybe the time and budget wasn't there to have a 4th game attached, but seeing as Ratchet Deadlocked got a PS3 port separately from the Ratchet trilogy, it was just a bummer back in the PS3 days to see Jak X get left in the dust. However, the Jak series' history with ports and re-releases is quite messy as is. These segments in my videos about ports tend to go on pretty long, so I'll try to keep this discussion pretty brief, as I do think it's warranted to give my thoughts on the various versions of the Jak games now that we're at the last Naughty Dog game. But I don't want to be here all day, so here we go. The most complete way to experience these games today is on PS2, warts and all. These versions showcase the games as they were originally made and intended to be seen, however, some notes I should bring up. Jak X's original Black Label release had a memory card glitch that could wipe your whole save file or worse, corrupt your memory card entirely. This was fixed for the Greatest Hits release on PS2. If you play Jak X on a backwards compatible PS3, for some reason the game will just not load past the tutorial, but if you skip the tutorial, you can continue the game if I remember correctly. The PS3 Jak collection is largely fine. In fact, before the PC version, I'd say this was the best way to play the Precursor legacy, running at 720p and having no issues I could speak on. Jak II is largely the same, removing the issues with performance drops and screen tearing, but the elephant in the room is this cutscene that reveals Core as the villain was completely ruined since his face looks like it was covered in ink. Jak 3 also has the same pros as Jak II HD, however the vehicles are much more annoying to deal with than they were on PS2 since they skid turn with very little input from the controller. So yeah, Jak 3 is way better on PS2. The Jak trilogy was then released on Vita a year later, and this has got to be one of the worst port jobs I've ever seen. Broken music, slippery controls on vehicles, a frame rate locked at 20 FPS that frequently drops below that in Jak 2 and 3, textures and effects that don't look anything like they're supposed to, and you have an abysmal handheld port of great games. If you're one of the few who have fully completed the trilogy on Vita, you have my props. I think it's barely playable. Sonic Genesis tier bad. You have to imagine that this is the byproduct of extremely rushed development on the publisher's end and very difficult code to work with on the developer end. You gotta feel bad for the people who have to port these Jak games, as the PS2 games are all made with a custom coding language that the people behind the ports have had to detangle. So the HD collection being as good as it is a feat. Just look at what the people who worked on the games had to say in this behind the scenes on the HD collection.
Naughty Dog will probably tell you they told us at the beginning that this is an impossible project. And it wasn't long before we agreed with them.
We had like completely custom tools and completely custom way of using all the hardware. Made stuff back and forth between all the different processors and like did weird stuff on the old PlayStation 1 processor you weren't supposed to, and it was just a very complicated design.
Yeah, we didn't think when we were making the game of the people that would come through and improve the game.
So one would assume that it being announced that all 4 Jak games were coming to PS4 via their PS2 emulation service would mean that we were getting the original Jak games without all the BS. And you'd be very wrong. Of the console versions, the Jak games on PS4 and PS5 are the games at their absolute worst. These games have always been notoriously difficult to emulate as well, as these PS4 ports show that off best with broken effects, frequent frame drops, and graphical glitches. Thankfully, this version did see numerous patches post-launch. I mean, when it came out on PS4, the boost trails in the cars in Jak X barely touched the vehicles, stuff like that. Jak X has been patched to the point where it's largely playable, especially compared to the trilogy, but overall I think the PS4 versions are a dumpster fire, as several videos on YouTube have gone into. I mean, this version screws up the controls to the point where moving the analog stick in a circle feels awkward and stiff, unlike the other versions, because at launch, Jak could only move in 8 directions on PS4, and I believe that's now been updated to 16, so great. And that's that. Like I said, I tried to keep that little bit brief. Now let us resume discussing Jak X as originally released. So you have all these modes and missions at your fingertips. How does it work in the campaign? Well, in the story mode, you have 4 cups. By beating each mission, you get a maximum of 3 points depending on your performance. You need 50 points to unlock the Grand Prix of each cup, and by beating one, you move on to the next, repeat the process a few more times and you've beaten the game. And this is why it's good that the game has a variety of race modes and combat maps, since the game is pretty long. Maybe too long. There are 4 cups, and the one that I beat the easiest was the 3rd one in 90 minutes. The other 3 all took me over 2 hours. Jak X is a full-length Jak and Daxter game. I enjoy playing the game for most of its runtime, however I'd be lying if I didn't say that by the 3rd and 4th cups I was thinking, okay, how many more races does it take to get to 50 medals? Because after a certain point, you've seen pretty much everything the game has to offer, and it's just a matter of playing more of it until it's over. The game took me forever to beat the first time. I mentioned at the top of the video that I first got my hands on this game in 2012, the fall to be specific, and then I didn't actually beat it until the summer of 2015. That's my entire middle school career of on and off trying to beat Jak X Combat Racing, because the game is lengthy, but it's also pretty difficult. If you don't have a grasp on how to use defensive items, you'll get wrecked and get bronze medals, further lengthening the playtime. And then the 4 Grand Prix each have high stakes. To win these, you need to play 3 races back to back. If you restart, you go back to the first one. You get points for each one you win, 10 if you get in first place, 8 in second, and so on. If you have the highest amount of points by the end of race 3, then you win. On my first time doing the final Grand Prix in 2015, I was getting so mad because I would just barely lose out in these long tour tracks. But I'm not criticizing the game here, I'm just noting that it took me an eon to beat this game back in the day. To the point where when I reviewed Jak X for the first time back in 2016, I actually didn't play the whole game. I watched all the cutscenes and played like 1 cup or like a half a cup and just decided to review that, thinking it would take me weeks to beat the game. Yeah, if you ever wondered why I try to re-review games that I did in 9th grade, Exhibit A. But it's just funny because I replayed the first 4 Jak games back in 2019 and it took me a weekend to beat Jak X, and I was like, damn, who knew? And then for this video, I once again beat the game in a 48-hour period. Who knew it could be so simple? Even though racing can start to wear on you by the 6th or 7th hour of playtime, you still have plenty of motivation to see the game through to the finish line, and that's because of the game's story. I didn't hide the fact that I thought Jak 3's plot was a mess last week, and I think Jak X is a wholesale improvement. This is especially worthy of praise since this is a racing game. The team mentioned in the commentary track that they needed to come up with story beats that would be resolved in the racetrack, and beats that the audience actually cares about, you know? CTR had a reason why you were racing, but not one that the audience would be invested in. It's just a cartoon setup, nothing more, nothing less. But Jak X took the biggest thing from Jak II, using story as a reward for gameplay, and then they pulled that off in a racing game, which is a job well done. Where Jak 3 went wrong was its unfocused main plot, its overly large cast of characters, and its villains. Jak X is much simpler. The plot is just Jak and friends need to race to get that antidote, so that's the most important thing. Everyone's on board with that basic goal. But this leaves room for more complexity between characters, such as it being the elephant in the room that Jak is the one who left crew for dead and Rain doesn't know this, which comes to light at the end of the game from GT Blitz, causing her to trust Jak less. Or how Kira, who's been a support character from day one, wants to finally get in the mix herself, but Samos is against it, which gets resolved by her finally joining the races in the last cup. The game still has a pretty large amount of characters in the plot, like how Sig shows up to support the team, Cleaver joins to muck in your mud, and you face other rival characters like Razor and UR86, but centering the plot around the Grand Championship makes the plot easier to follow than Jak III. Sig is here to race, and he's going to offer his underworld knowledge as best he can. The whole plot sees you gradually unravel the conspiracy of Mizo, the crime boss rigging the tournament in his favor, as you upset the balance of power by winning more races. The mystery of the story also concerns the event's commentator, GT Blitz, whose father was killed by the Mizo Syndicate back when he was a racer, but Blitz doesn't seem to care, he just wants ratings. Although on the subject of Blitz, he's where the story's humor comes from. While you could say his bit of being the flashy showman gets old by the end of the first cup, it gets really funny when Pecker gets added as his co-commentator and the two just trade insults in highly comedic fashion. Once you win the Grand Prix, you get the antidote as Rain explains that Crew was trying to defeat Mizo for years, but can never ID the guy, and that's because Mizo doesn't exist. GT was Mizo all along, having set up his own father's death as revenge for the man caring so much about racing, and then running this crime syndicate ever since, maintaining cover by being the lead commentator. But the winner of this race determined who would run organized crime in Crash City. In a desperate move to stay on top, Mizo steals the antidote as Jak chases after him. It's a pretty simple final boss where you have to shoot Mizo's car until he has no health left, although I have to mention something really funny that I've never seen before. The mission ends as soon as Mizo runs out of health, but his AI forgot to jump off this ramp, so Mizo just fell into the abyss, not even 25% of the way through the battle, and just won automatically. That was funny. But of course, Jak gets the antidote and gets the last word in on Mizo in a really satisfying way.
You have a habit of leaving people to die, don't you? You get used to it.
Bringing us to the ending where everyone is cured and the day is saved. But in one final twist, it turns out that Rain was never poisoned and was never innocent either. She's now in control of organized crime in the city and couldn't have done it without the help of Jak and friends. Although she did actually grow to like them, even though she knows they're definitely not friends now. But the heroes just say, hey, well, at least we're good.
The important thing is we won. And we're alive.
And we brought down that scumbag Mizo.
And we rocked the racing circuit, right, Jak?
Finally allowing Jak and Kira the moment they've been denied game after game.
Will you kiss her already? Sheesh. Oh yeah, that's what I call a photo finish.
And that's Jak X. Honestly, I don't have too much to say about this one in conclusion. I mean, I've said it all already. The game is a satisfying combat racer with a slick aesthetic and vibe and a cool story. What more could you want? As an epilogue to Naughty Dog's time with the Jak and Daxter series, I think you can't go wrong with Jak X, although I'm probably not going to play this game again anytime soon. It's a bit wearying by the very end, but it's a great game overall. Similar to Crash before it, I think Naughty Dog was wise to close the series and move on to something new. The Jak series was always experimental, trying new things every time to see what worked. It was good of them to stick with it for a generation and give it a proper conclusion, but I think moving on to more stable, evergreen franchises was a wise move. Now that, through Jak and Daxter, they learned what they wanted to make. That doesn't take away from my love of Jak, I'm just saying that creatively I see why they went the direction they did, and I'll just enjoy the ride of Jak and Daxter for what it was. Although the Jak series didn't end here. In 2005, it was announced that Sony's PlayStation Portable was going to receive an exclusive Jak title, simply titled Daxter, which was set for release in early 2006. Developed by Ready at Dawn Studios, Daxter being their first game. As they then went on to develop the God of War PSP games, the collection of those games, and The Order 1886 on PlayStation 4. Today they do Oculus Rift games, but now we're just going to focus on Daxter, their first release. One that I do have a decent bit of nostalgia for. In a previous video concerning PSP games, I mentioned that I was absolutely resolute on getting a PSP back in 2007 due to the release of Sonic Rivals 2 on the system that year. When I got it, I also managed to nab Sonic Rivals 1, and to sweeten the deal, my console was a bundle that included a copy of Daxter, a game I didn't even know existed until it was in my possession. Only it didn't come with a case, it was with a weird sleeve thing. I still have that disc to this day, and I might even still have that Family Guy episode it came bundled with, although I don't know where it is, I'd have to look for it. I remember loading that one thinking I was getting a video game and ended up watching Family Guy for 22 minutes. Still the only prolonged exposure to the series I've had to this day. But as for Daxter, here I was playing a Jak game I didn't even know existed, that I didn't even ask for. And back then I actually liked the Sonic Rivals games. So needless to say, this was quite the score for me back in 2007. Although I definitely was not the only person playing Daxter. The PSP, while not nearly as popular as its rival, the Nintendo DS, still sold 80 million units, and so the player base was quite large. Daxter being one of its best-selling games, pushing more in sales than Jak III and Jak X even, which definitely came as a surprise to me since I regard this one as a PSP side game, when it actually sold better than Naughty Dog's last two PS2 entries. Despite that, people don't really talk about this one that much today. Its lack of re-releases certainly didn't help that, but in terms of the fan base, you see people talking about the Jak trilogy and Jak X, maybe giving a little mention to the Lost Frontier killing the franchise, but this one is definitely underrepresented in the discourse. I myself barely play or think about this one as well. I never beat it as a kid for a reason I can explain later. I got it on the Vita store in 2014 when I first got that system, and that's when I finally beat it. Playing it again for the review I did 6 years ago, and now I'm back to play it once more despite never having touched it once in those 6 years. So is this game any good? Is it worth busting out a PSP or Vita to play? Well, that's what we'll find out today. When going into a Daxter game, you might wonder, what would it even be about? Well, they picked a really good answer to that question. Daxter begins in Haven City with a struggling insect exterminator business run by Osmo. One day, he sees a giant light as something plummets to the ground, this being the moment that Jak and Daxter arrive in Haven City at the start of Jak II. You know the story. Daxter escapes while Jak gets captured by the Crimson Guard, and 2 years later, Daxter rescues Jak, beginning the events of Jak II. The Daxter game fills in the blank of these 2 years as Dax is telling tall tales in a bar for 2 years straight until Osmo catches up with him to give him a job at the Critter Ritter shop, which puts Daxter on the path to rescue Jak, as seen in Jak II. An excellent setup for a Daxter solo game, filling in the blank on something we wouldn't have asked many questions about before, but now we have concrete info on what happened to Daxter that led to his rescuing Jak. From the get-go, there are many things with Daxter I was really impressed by. For a relatively early release on PSP, it showed off what the system could do in several ways. For starters, a variety of aesthetically pleasing areas and stable performance. It's not 60 FPS, but for a PSP game, the performance target is stable. Sometimes I saw it dip, but not to the point where that would be a noteworthy takeaway from the experience. In the forest area, I noticed some pop-in as well, but again, for handheld gaming in 2006, it really showed how much more powerful the PSP was, given the fact that the prior era of gaming handhelds was the Game Boy Advance, which couldn't even dream of doing anything like the kind of visuals you'd see in Daxter. Fully 3D gameplay in areas, multiple cutscenes with high-quality animation, and its entire script being voice-acted? That was a pretty high bar for 2006 PSP standards. The console wanted its games to feel like less powerful PS2 games, and of its early release stuff, I think Daxter demonstrated that pretty damn well. Seeing the player explore tiny bits of the massive Haven City from Jak II, the industrial district and the port to be specific. The PSP housing these environments really showing what the console was capable of. I also noticed that Daxter has more fur in this game than usual. Well, in the entirely pre-rendered cutscenes, but still, it's new. I feel like Daxter's cutscene model in Jaks 2 through X is more aesthetically pleasing with the simpler fur texture, but I found out that the reason they gave him more fur in scenes was so that Daxter's character would have a little bit more to his design now that he's the focus character, which makes sense. In gameplay, he still looks exactly how he did in the PS2 games, we're just talking about cutscenes. And while we're talking about how the game's presented, I figured now would be a great time to address the fact that I think the soundtrack in this game is another really high quality one. Despite Daxter being a silly character by nature, the music for his game goes for more atmospheric and dangerous vibe as you explore the depths of Haven City, like the brewery, the transit system, or the fish cannery. In more recent videos, I've dropped the habit of letting music play out, but in the case of these Jak games, I feel like it's worth it because so far, the series is 5 for 5 when it comes to music I can vibe with while playing. When reviewing games like Daxter, you never really know what kind of video you're going to get out of it. I'm someone who likes covering all the games of my favorite franchises, especially if those franchises are more niche so they don't have a million games. But the part that is the mystery with games like this is, will it be a spin-off that you feel there's a lot to say about, like Secret Agent Clank because of how awful it was, or will it be more by the numbers? Daxter is definitely in the second category of those two. Daxter is a good game, but when looking at its mechanics, it pretty much stops there. What I first noticed was that the game is paced pretty well. Despite taking place in the world of Jak II, the mission structure is much more like Jak III. You don't repeatedly have to go back to the Critter Ritter shop for new missions, you just go to the hotel and then get told to make it to the construction site. The flow is kept up by taking you from mission to mission, and the areas are very close to one another, so you never feel like you're commuting from place to place, as the game just keeps the action going almost non-stop. Perk of it being a handheld game. Since players are playing on the bus or on the train, you don't want to have traveling to gameplay being a significant chunk of time, just get to the point. You also don't tend to revisit areas much in Daxter compared to Jak 2 and 3, where you would do a mission in the sewers and then come back later in the game to do something else there. You do return to the construction site once, but largely Daxter is a game where you do one grand mission at the brewery and then that's that. Levels in this game are very focused on platforming. I kind of forgot about that when getting back into this game for the video, because it definitely took me by surprise to see levels like the transit station seeing you get on top of a train and dodge these lasers coming from various directions and hopping from one train to another, or multiple levels having you time your spray hover ability to get past gaps. If you want a game with consistent platforming action, you can't go wrong with Daxter, since its whole runtime has it in abundance. Daxter also plays well too. He was playable in Jak II and III during specific set pieces, but was just a Jak clone in terms of handling. But here, they gave him a more unique moveset as he fights with this electric fly swatter that you use for a basic combo, and if you hit an enemy with the last hit on said combo, you'll repeat it on the nearest enemy. The game encourages you to go combo mad with that. To unlock more moves, you have to first gather up Precursor orbs in the stages. Collecting certain numbers of them unlocks these Dream Sequence QTE movie reference games you play. Say that 10 times fast. There's not much to these, but I think it's fun as a brief distraction from the main gameplay, especially when they ramp up in the amount of buttons you have to press at once. I also think the various ways Daxter is designed to fit into various movies was charming. Besides that, Precursor orbs also unlock secrets like concept art and behind the scenes, and in gameplay you can find secret items that allow you to wear different masks, like Jak, Human Daxter, or Samos, or even having ones for Ratchet and Clank, and of course, Sly Cooper. Instantly making the game better since you can play it with Sly's face. The game always reminded me of Sly when I was a kid, as you'd have to attack with a close-range weapon crawling through vents and stuff. Now, that's come full circle. Anyway, besides the electric swatter, you also attack enemies with your spray gun. The upgrades to your gun also felt really well paced. You get the gun in the second mission, and then the game spends the rest of the mission teaching you how to use it, and then you unlock the hover ability and use it throughout the next few areas. Then you get access to the flame mod with 2 areas open in the port that both tutorialize different abilities with the flame mod. The first showing its combat prowess as it lights metalheads on fire, and the other showing how it can help with platforming by melting ice. You repeat the process with the ultrasonic attachment that destroys crowds of enemies both from a distance and from above, and then you use all the skills combined in the final areas. At the end of the day, I think the game is mechanically sound. Daxter's jump and double jump feels a bit slippery, but other than that, I really can't tell you anything the game does wrong from a mechanical standpoint. It's just very bland as a game. They created a decent combat system, they structured the game in a well-paced way in terms of progression and unlockables, but the game just never really left much of an impression on me throughout. I did have some issues with the game, like how it's occasionally difficult to know where you're going in a more open-ended mission like the lumber mill, since there's no map in the actual stages, so when I have one target left in the mill, I can't be sure what ground I have and have not covered, so I run around aimlessly in the hopes of finding it, only to realize that the one spot I did cover had 2 targets instead of 1 like all the rest. That would have been good to know, and a map like the one in Jak II and III would have saved me there. I never got far in this game as a kid because I could never find the last eco crystal in the strip mine, and that's also a result of just not knowing where I'm going at any given time. I also felt like these button mashing minigames mid-mission came out of nowhere a lot of the time and felt really shoehorned in with little fanfare, and the vehicle segments all felt really slow, lacking the tension they had in previous games. So yeah, it's not like the game is perfect and didn't leave a huge impression, it's much more that I thought the game was mechanically solid and well structured, has replay value with unlockable Easter eggs and skins, and was a very serviceable game for its 4-hour runtime, but it's never doing anything so incredible that makes it a must-play. Not that every game has to completely knock your socks off, it's just that this is kind of the thing with handheld spin-offs like this. When your goal is to make an authentic Jak game on PSP in 2006, well, mission accomplished, but once the shine is worn off and that fact is no longer impressive on its own since handheld gaming has evolved to where console quality games are the expectation, the game is just left to being good in its own merits, and Daxter definitely is good on its own merits, but doesn't really do much else to impress you, making it pretty bland on the replay. What I did find interesting about Daxter is how they used the game's place in the timeline to expand upon the series' lore. In the first half of the game, Daxter's just hunting bugs, but we all know that these new bugs are the metalheads just beginning their attack on Haven City. In Jak II, you start by facing the smaller dog-like metalheads and by the end are facing off against huge monsters, and you see even bigger ones in Jak III. So it's fitting that when going backwards in the timeline, the enemies you fight before Jak II are even smaller, but are also to scale with Daxter as a character, so its timeline placement suits the game mechanics well. In the back half of the game, the story gets more focused, as Daxter remembers that he needs to rescue his best friend Jak when a prison ship flies by with Jak in it. It's a little weird to make it a gag that Daxter forgot about Jak, taking his carefree attitude a little too far, but once he's set on rescuing Jak, that becomes the most important thing for the rest of the game. And once Daxter sets his sights on that, the player gets more insight in the lore. Like how Errol makes a cameo, being back to who he was in Jak II. But what's new was that we see him in a meeting with Count Veigar from Jak III. Viger is insisting that Praxis and Errol use light eco on Jak and the other test subjects because he, like he did in Jak III, believes that dark eco is an abomination. Also mentioning that he's got his sights set in the secret of the Precursors. Expanding the universe by showing Viger's ambitions were there in Jak II, we just didn't see him in that game. In this scene, we also learn that the Dark Warrior program has killed every test subject that isn't Jak because his eco powers are keeping him alive. Another interesting tidbit is that Errol mentions that Onan claims Jak is special due to his eco powers. From this, you could infer that Onan was the one who told Praxis and Errol that Jak was going to be where he was at the start of Jak II so they could capture him.
We've been waiting for you.
But why though? Onan was on your side in Jak II. Well, I think that what they were going for was that in Jak II, Onan had some larger perspective on the way things were going to play out.
She says it is good to see you again, Jak. But we've never met before. Before, after, it is all the same.
So by adding this detail, I think Onan made it so that Jak would undergo the Dark Eco experiment specifically because it would take away his Precursor interactivity, thus making it so Jak's older self could not open the Precursor stone, allowing Metal Core to feed on the life force inside. And then Jak could use these dark powers to battle against Metal Core and win out, saving Jak's younger self and starting the time loop I discussed in the Jak II video. This idea of mine has evidence backing it in Jak II, but Daxter seals the deal. Also, while I'm on the discussion of Errol, the scene that tries being comedic with him here makes the guy more entertaining in one scene than he was in the entirety of Jak III.
Someone call about a bug infestation?
What? I haven't heard about any infestation. Who called you?
Your boy, you know, Captain Zyman, Rupert Tickjackmos.
Nice try. That call didn't happen. Captain Rupert Tickjackmos is on leave this month. He couldn't have been the one.
Speaking of Core, he's also in this game. Directing Kaidan, a metalhead, to disguise himself and go into the city and shut down every insect exterminator shop, but Ozma refuses to back down, causing Core to grow impatient with Kaidan, especially as it becomes clear to Core that Daxter's gonna rescue Jak. But here's something that doesn't make sense to me. Maybe you all in the comments can help make some sense of it. Core explains that the metalheads have just found their way to breach the shield wall in Haven City, explaining why it's only the tiniest of bugs you face. And at this point, he still would have his deal with Baron Praxis, so he's just barely attacking the city on the outskirts as agreed upon. But what confuses me is this part at the end.
If Daxter breaks the eco-user out of prison, this Jak, I could still meet them both outside, in disguise.
Which should be cool, as Core doesn't think Kaidan will succeed in killing Daxter, so he plans on something else. Disguise himself as an old man so he can meet Jak and Daxter outside once they've escaped, and use them to his advantage in his quest to undermine Praxis and get the Precursor Stone, which directly ties the end of Daxter into the beginning of Jak II. However, this scene makes it seem like Core only just thought of the old man disguise, like 30 minutes before seeing Jak and Daxter, but he was already a member of the Underground when you meet him in Jak II, since he refers you to Torn to meet the Shadow. That, and he also had the kid with him, who we know was found by the Shadow first and given to Core to look after while the Shadow planned the missions for the Underground. Unless Core had already been in the city gaining the trust of the Underground before this point with this very disguise, only he just now thinks to use it on Jak, but then I just think it's a bit of an inconsistency that he just thinks up this disguise. One you can wrap your mind around, but one that goes unexplained in the game. But the Jak games in general have some plot inconsistencies that don't get addressed at any point in the series, such as Jak's uncle from Jak I, or how in Jak II, I feel like the idea was that Haven City was the last refuge of humanity from the Metalhead menace, and that the Wasteland was where the Metalhead nest was at. But then Jak III shows an entire desert civilization in the Wasteland. That I can accept, but then Jak X has Crash City right nearby Haven on the map with decades of its own history of combat racing that you get mixed in with. The backstory of Jak X said that the city and the sport were getting back on their feet after the Darkmaker attack in Jak III, but then, how were they doing before when the Metalheads were attacking in Jak II right next door? Unless the Metalheads were only attacking Haven because they wanted the Precursor Stone that sat in Mars' tomb. I don't know, I'm just saying these kinds of questions go unanswered. But having said that, I love Jak and Daxter lore, hence why I would even bother talking about it to this extent in the first place. And I'm glad Daxter contributes to it because everything else in the story goes in one ear and out the other. Mainly the new characters, Terran, Simon, and Osmo. They aren't bad characters, but they just fulfill roles in the checklist like the wise older guy who isn't Samos, or the attractive woman Daxter's gonna hit on who isn't Ashlyn or Tess. Very one-note characters as you spend more time focusing on how the old characters relate to this new story. The new characters just don't really add much or even get satisfactory resolutions. Like Daxter taking on a tiny dot as a sidekick who gets killed by Kaidan. That was kinda random. and how Simon's last note is giving you the outfit they found for Jak, explaining why Daxter just has that at the start of Jak II.
I brought you some new threads. Put them on.
But otherwise doesn't do anything as a character in the game besides being a surfer bro. Osmo's shop blows up before the final level, but we don't really see what he does after that in the ending. The final shot shows Simon and Osmo at Jak and Company at the Naughty Otzel celebrating the defeat of Metal Core after the end of Jak II, making it so we could infer that he got the business back up and running, but the story knows you don't really care about that, as fans in the end be more hyped about how it connected directly to Jak II's opening, instead of seeing fleshed out resolutions to the new plot. Which I think is a good way to describe the whole experience in a way. I gave this game a lot more criticism the first time around 6 years ago, but now there really wasn't anything about Daxter I seriously didn't like, and there are things it does that I did quite like. It's a well-made game, but it's just not memorable and is overall a one-and-done type game. Of all the Jak and Ratchet games released on PSP, this was definitely the best one, probably because it was made by Ready at Dawn, and the other three were done by a different, singular studio. But still, Daxter impresses me visually, and with how it feels like an authentic Jak game in terms of art design, story, and gameplay. But it's just not doing anything to set itself apart as a game you'd want to revisit. I've explained the various tiers through which I see games in a previous video. I don't think rating games is necessary in every video, although if you want this system to be mentioned in each game I review, I suppose I could. I bring it up now because I kept thinking, if I were to put Daxter on a tier list, where would it be? Well, it's certainly quality enough to be a B tier game, which is the all-around good game tier, but I kept thinking about other games I'd rate a B and thought Daxter wasn't as good as those. So it's the most positive form of a C tier game. It's not doing anything wrong, and is in fact doing a lot right. But those things don't make it an experience with any staying power, so it gets a C because it's a decent game, just nothing special. Compared to Jak III, which is in C tier because of the flaws that actively drag the experience down, although I would probably rather replay that game anyway. It's hard to quantify what I'm trying to say here, but I hope you get it. It sounds like a harsh rating, but really I don't have anything against this game, it's just that in the grand scheme of things, it's just kinda there. Like I said, when going into handheld spin-off games like this for review, there often isn't much to say if the game is overall good besides, it's neat for the time and does some interesting stuff, but only the hardcore fans should seek it out. Having said that, I think that just about covers Daxter, meaning that there's only one Jak revisit left, this being a spin-off people do talk about much more. Jak and Daxter, The Lost Frontier, which released all the way back in 2009 on the PlayStation Portable and PlayStation 2. A game that, you may be surprised to hear, was originally being developed by Naughty Dog. The story goes that after working on Jak X, it was time for the team to fully get in gear for the new franchise on PS3, a full action-adventure title starring a real-life human, which ended up being Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. But it turns out that Naughty Dog was also looking to develop for the PlayStation Portable. I mean, it's a new Sony device, we're a Sony team, we haven't tackled handheld games yet, might as well give it a shot, and so they began developing the next Jak game for the PSP. But the problems arose with this approach because the PS3 was an infamously tough system to develop for, and in addition to that you had the natural challenges that arose at the start of the 7th gen with games going full HD. Well, HD at the time. 720p is nothing to write home about now, but you know what I mean. Developing Uncharted was such a demanding task for ND that their PSP team working on a Jak game had to be shelved to get all hands on deck to make sure they properly understood the PS3 hardware to use it to max efficiency like the studio had done for the PS1 and the PS2, and then ship the product when all was said and done. Not to get too in-depth on Uncharted's history, as this isn't the Uncharted video, but I'm bringing it up because it concerns what became of Jak PSP. This is where the studio High Impact Games comes in. This was a team that was formed in the 2000s by people who once had worked at Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog in the PS2 days. Their first release was on the PSP in 2007, Ratchet & Clank Size Matters, something the team was naturally cut out for given their history at Insomniac. Size Matters proved to be a massive success on PSP, and 1 year later they released another Ratchet PSP spin-off, Secret Agent Clank. To this day, Ratchet fans still remember these games fondly. I covered them last summer after I did the PS2 games in that series if you were curious. But to put it lightly, I think both games are absolutely abysmal when going back to them. The former being a game that could have been good with some simple changes to how it was balanced, but the game we got quickly becomes a frustrating affair with weak weapons and overpowered enemies. The latter game is just one of the worst I've ever played. A game that just boggles the mind with its weak writing, frustrating and boring levels, and an onslaught of minigames, and just everything I don't like in a game. But the positive reception they got on their Ratchet PSP titles would make them prime candidates to take over where Naughty Dog left off on Jak PSP. And hey, Naughty Dog starting development might mean good things, right? Well, not really. Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier is a game that fans were dissatisfied with from day one, for many reasons that we'll get into before the next half hour or so is up. Yeah, no hot take this week. The Lost Frontier is not a good game, and it's easily the worst Jak and Daxter game. One I was pretty excited for when it was released. I mean, it's another Jak game, but a proper platforming sequel. We hadn't had one in 5 years at this point. It was one of my 3 most anticipated games of the year. But of course, one of them was a children's tie-in game, one was a lame-as-all Get-Out Jak game, and the other was Batman Arkham Asylum. That one's an all-time classic, but that is of course a story for another day. Back on target, I want to say I'm not trying to make a hit job on the people who make these games. I'm just stating my opinion, since I like talking about every game in my favorite franchises. So when I revisit these PSP spin-offs that I played a lot as a kid, some part of me hopes that this playthrough might change things and I can see it in a new light. But in the case of these 3 games, it actually ends up coming out worse than it did before. So what's not to like about Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier? Well, the game begins with Jak, Daxter, and someone who, sources say, is Kira traveling to the edge of the world because the world is running out of eco and they're seeking out more of it to save the world. Without it, the planet is seeing eco storms raging almost constantly. They get ambushed by sky pirates and the scuffle causes them to crash land at the brink, the edge of the world, because apparently the Precursors never finished making this planet and so they just had to cut it off at this point. While none of what I just said made any sense, you get back in the air and aid the European people in their battle against the Sky Pirates, making a truce with them for the time being, getting us into the Lost Frontier. As I said, before the first cutscene is over, I have several questions, but I'll just stick to the gameplay for now. The early game had me doubting my memories of this game, because when looking at the game's structure and pacing, I should be singing its praises. I mean, you get a full platforming tutorial level, an intro to how sky combat works, a shooting tutorial with more platforming, another plane mission, and then a big level with platforming, new powers, combat, and the works. I thought Jak III's opening act was really poorly paced, since it bombarded players with minigame after minigame after minigame, not giving you a proper platforming mission until an hour into the game. The Lost Frontier is actually much more consistent at first, dogfighting mission followed by a massive platforming stage. Structure that could totally work, but I obviously don't think it works, and that's because Jak's movement is very stiff. Jak felt great to control in the PS2 trilogy because of how seamlessly you could go from his standard running to rolling and jumping out of a roll, his uppercut and dive being extensions of your moveset as well. That synergy between Jak's actions is just not in the Lost Frontier, so now movement just feels slow. The game just doesn't have the physics of previous games, making the platforming far more by the books as you jump from one to the next. His attacks can't be seamlessly integrated into your movement, so instead, you wait several seconds to rebound from the ground pound, for example. It looks and technically plays like Jak, it just doesn't feel like Jak, making all the regular gameplay a chore. No greater example than combat. This also feels pretty limp, as your basic punches and spins technically do damage, but the enemies barely react to it, and since you're pretty committed to almost every attack you do, enemies ganging up on you is pretty common. Even the uppercut, which should allow you to get some room from enemies, doesn't do nearly as good a job as it did in previous games because again, the enemies don't really react to it. With guns, it's the same problem. The scattergun does not put distance between you and your enemies like it did in Jak II and Jak III, and the Vulcan Fury does not stun enemies, making it still quite easy to be torn to shreds when enemies get too close. The most effective weapon is the blaster, as the spin kick combo is more useful than ever as you can get enemies locked in a loop until they die. The Peacemaker isn't in this game. Instead, you get a basic grenade launcher called the Lobber, which isn't as cool to be sure, but I think it's effective for what it is. Now, in terms of combat, I really don't know why it was as limp feeling as it was in this game. Similar to the Ratchet & Clank games that were made by High Impact Games, making weapons do good damage, making your attacks pack a punch, and having proper balance isn't really a hardware issue, it's a design issue. Now, the Lost Frontier doesn't have the damage problem those Ratchet games did, but why does the scattergun not put distance between you and the enemies? Why does the uppercut not launch enemies into the air, especially the small ones? These are tinier things that really add up. Now, in regards to how Jak plays, that much I can give some leniency on. Quite frankly, I don't think the PSP was capable of doing Jak's gameplay a lot of justice. Now, I'm sure if Naughty Dog had developed it, it would be based on the code from the PS2 games, so it would have felt a little better in combat, but I'm referring to the controls. If you play a lot of PSP games based on PS2 franchises, you'll quickly see how held back the games were by the PSP not having a second analog stick. In a 3D action game, you have to be able to control the camera, so PSP games all had to come up with their own idea as to how they would go about it. Some games, like Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, used the D-pad as a camera, and other games used L and R to turn the camera left and right, The Lost Frontier being one of those games. But in Jak II, shooting was on R1, with the camera naturally being on the second stick. The PSP didn't have L2 or R2 nor a second stick, so yeah, the game has the camera on the shoulder buttons, but that means shooting had to be on triangle, the only button left in the controller to use. It just feels even more awkward to play as a result of that. The Ratchet games barely got away with the limited control scheme since you already used circle to shoot in Ratchets 1 and 2 on PS2, and with the strafing mechanic being automatic, circling around enemies is no problem. Hitting L and R at once in Size Matters also allowed you to long jump, which was cumbersome but doable. Here, rolling just wouldn't work with the camera and the button layout, so it was axed. And after finishing that sentence, I gotta say, it feels really weird to use Ratchet and Clank Size Matters and Secret Agent fucking Clank as a positive example, but here we are. In this game, without those mechanics, the gameplay just feels clunky and lame, and there wasn't much they could have done about it while trying to be faithful to the mechanics of Jak while also dealing with this console. Although I am going to mention the most bizarre bug I've seen in a game in a hot minute. Sometimes when turning the camera, the entire game speed would slow down to like 50 or 60% speed. I'm not joking, just watch. This would happen frequently, and the only way to stop it was by dying. Has anyone ever seen that before? I never have. Although this was actually my first time playing The Lost Frontier on PSP. Well, the PSP version on the Vita TV, but still. I mentioned before that this game got a PS2 port developed in-house at High Impact, like the Size Matters port. I wasn't sure what the Jak fan consensus was and which version of the two was better. Ratchet fans are very confident in the PS2 version having butchered this classic game, but my comments show that some Jak fans still do believe that the PSP version of The Lost Frontier is superior as a game. Now that I've played all three of these games on PS2 and PSP, I'm gonna say that I am sick of this absolute hoax. On PS2, The Lost Frontier has better controls because the second analog stick is used for the camera, which in some segments is extended to be a full 360 degrees. Shooting is on R1, the eco powers are all D-pad combos, the resolution is doubled to 480p, and that's that. The PSP version has better lighting, more colorful environments, and more stable performance because my god, The Lost Frontier on PS2 runs like ass with frequent slowdown and ghosting effects. But the better controls is the deciding factor in my opinion. Better overall performance does make sense if that's someone's reason for preferring the game on PSP, but I have never seen someone bring it up, nor have I ever seen this camera rotation slowdown issue that was exclusive to the PSP version ever get brought up either. To this day, 14 years after Size Matters hit the PS2, and 13 years after Agent Clank and The Lost Frontier did, I have no idea where the high-impact hoax, as I'm gonna call it, came from. Best I can tell, the games all reviewed worse on PS2, but that's because if you play them as PSP games, it's more impressive, right? But I'm not even looking at it from that lens. The PSP was a powerful system in its day and had many technologically impressive games released on it, but it's still possible for the game to be good, which is the thing I'm judging it by. Sure, Daxter or Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops wouldn't be as fun on a console compared to the actual console games, but if a game is fun, then it's fun. These three are just not that, even with the enhancements brought to them on PS2. So to quote Baron Praxis,
"Pay no attention to this foolish hoax. The games are just as good on PS2 as they were on PSP. Maybe even better."
Maybe that wasn't an exact quote, but anyway. Because I think the combat and platforming is fundamentally not fun, it makes it so that all the new additions that are nice go in one ear and out the other, such as getting eco power-ups again. Red eco allows you to create explosions, yellow eco gives you the ability to propel yourself in the air, you can activate a shield and create crystals with green eco. Don't know why the life energy eco would do that, but still. And with blue eco you can teleport yourself and slow down time. Some segments even requiring you to use these powers in tandem, like teleporting across a pool of dark eco while also needing the shield raised. Things like that are a good way of scaling the difficulty and using all your abilities. I also like being able to use Dark Eco as currency to get upgrades to colored Eco abilities, like energy attacks in the yellow category or health upgrades in the green. But like I said, I fundamentally think this game isn't good, so rare moments of design I think are satisfying don't really leave an impact in the grand scheme of things. Although I should take this moment to issue a correction from the Jak II video. In it, I stated that Jak lost all his Eco powers in the experiment, but that's not true. That's the reason he even survives the Dark Warrior program to begin with. The Dark Eco just causes him to lose Precursor interactivity. That's all. I just had a misread of this line here from Metalcore at the end of Jak II.
Now that you've been altered with Dark Eco, the stone will never open for you. Your younger self, however, still has the pure gift.
For years, that misread caused me to think this game was breaking canon by giving Jak Eco powers again, but I was wrong. So you get off the hook for that one, game. But still, the game is overall more frustrating than anything else. Like when an enemy is clearly on radar but didn't spawn in, so I had to stand around waiting for the time to run out so I could do the segment again. Or the numerous camera angles that don't give me a good view, causing my demise, or when I can barely put any distance between me and this mutant mini-boss, giving it the ability to kill me in 2.75 nanoseconds. How about this part where you control Daxter in his shield, but he's flailing all over the place and I can barely steer him, once more leading to my doom several times over. But when the Lost Frontier isn't annoying me, it's just incredibly boring. The two major game elements are the platforming and the dogfighting combat. I think having aerial battles was a good idea for a Jak game. The series had explored almost every other way of competing with vehicles, so this was a natural next step. I think the planes you unlock all have good handling, like you pull down on the stick to pull up and vice versa, as the plane takes a second to actually do it, which doesn't sound good, but it feels like you're controlling a heavy plane, which I like. Even on PSP, the controls work well. The D-pad doing evasive maneuvers like turning around and the barrel roll.
Actually, it's called an aileron.
Shut up, commenter, no one cares. Like the cars in Jak X, the planes in the Lost Frontier have a decent bit of customization. Not in terms of appearance, but destroyed planes drop scrap metal that you can use to buy new weapons and upgrade the ones you have, mixing and matching to make each plane to your liking. However, here is where the problems begin. A little gimmick mode like this can be just fine as a way of breaking up the regular gameplay, but similar to the PSP Ratchet games, they make it overstay its welcome by quite a large chunk of time. I'm mainly thinking about this phase towards the end of the game where you have to defend the Sky Pirate base from these turret towers, and this goes on for, no lie, 20 minutes. Because you have to destroy all 3 towers and then control a missile into the core of one of them, and if you die, you have to do it all over again. But then you have to destroy the turrets on the other 2 again and control another missile, and then a 3rd time and a 3rd missile for the last tower. There are checkpoints here, but why does it have to go on for so long? The mechanics of these planes aren't so great that it warrants playing for a half hour. But as if that wasn't bad enough, the next thing you do is fly through a vortex, and this goes on for 5 minutes as well. Only I died at the end and had to do the whole thing again. Once that was done, I was in another dogfight against the Europans, which took me over 20 minutes yet again. An entire hour of this dogfighting, which should go without saying, is quite overkill. But here's the most sinister part. During the mission with the turrets, I was told by the game that if I wanted to change my weapons, I could hit restart and was allowed that chance. I almost took the game up on that offer, but realized, no, I'm sure they'd have it go all the way back to the start with 3 towers standing, but if I kept trying with my current loadout, I would eventually win. Which I did. But then this massive battle with the Europans began, and I was getting destroyed, needed a different weapon, so I did try it, and what do you know, checkpoints be damned, all progress must be restarted on this mission. That's real nice. The whole game just feels unfinished, and it seems that it was. One of the designers at High Impact got interviewed by a Jak fan via email a few years back, and the interview was hosted on the Jak Wiki. He mentioned that the game had the shortest dev cycle of the 3 games they did for Jak and Ratchet, which kind of surprised me given the fact that it was only released a year and a half after Secret Agent Clank, which came out only 1 year after Size Matters, but maybe it was easier to do that game since the Ratchet gameplay was already programmed, and with Jak they had to start from scratch. And also, maybe they didn't get that full time to work on the Lost Frontier. Who knows? Either way, it's pretty clear to all parties involved that the Lost Frontier just didn't get the time in the oven needed to really do good in its ideas, which is why it feels padded out and clunky more than anything else. By the end of the Lost Frontier, I'm just left begging for the game to end. I don't want to play these levels, and I dread the dogfighting that awaits me afterwards. Case in point, the last main levels in the game, where I get these terrible camera angles that make it difficult to tell where I'm jumping, combat that's wonky and obnoxious against enemies and bosses, and then a massive dogfighting sequence to end the game where you first chase the main villain down for several minutes, only to then battle his ship for several minutes, watching the same animation of the shield going down 3 times to begin and end each phase. It's so boring. I'm just flying forward, blasting targets by mashing the shoot button. As I stated, you're just begging for the game to end. And of course, the terrible story isn't helping. It turns out that a lot of these conceptual ideas like Sky Pirates, the Eco Storms, and the Brink were all there when Naughty Dog was developing this game, but that doesn't change the fact that I think many of these concepts of the game don't make any sense. The Precursors didn't finish building the world? Like, what does that mean? They literally hang out in the core of the planet, why not? What were they doing down there, if not finishing the planet they made? I don't know how you can run out of eco in the first place when, as established, eco is literally what all life in the universe of Jak comes from. Maybe that could be explained via people using too many resources that drain the world's eco, but with it just being stated that eco is running out, it just makes me wonder how that's even possible. It's good that the plot has a small number of characters in it, don't want the bloated cast of cameos that Jak III had, but still, I think it would have been nice for it to be established in the backstory this was like a mission from Samos or Torn or whoever, to make it feel like we're still in the Jak world. Because as it stands, it just doesn't with this different setting, different characters, and a completely different Jak. Jak is portrayed by Josh Keaton in this game, who's a great actor and does a good job with the material, but man, Mike Irwin was Jak, and seeing him not in the game stings as a longtime fan. Especially since the beta cutscenes from Naughty Dog's version of the game leaked on the internet before the game came out, and Mike Irwin was in it to do the lines they needed. And the cutscene direction is a lot more like the previous games, the characters look more on model, and the lines are funnier. So, why Jak was recast remains a mystery to this day. Same for why Kira was recast in Jak III for that matter. Anyway, the story also introduces this random-ass element where Daxter gets touched by Dark Eco and turns into a monster called Dark Daxter. I'm sure you were wondering why this hadn't been mentioned thus far, and it's because genuinely I always forget this is in the game. Whenever I get to this intro cutscene for this, I sigh as I remember you have to play boring minigames where you bash enemies and obstacles, solving switch puzzles in an overhead view for like 6 minutes straight at a time. It's pretty bad. There's nothing going on here. It's the same brain rot as the other game modes, but without the good stuff. But the thing is, even while playing the game, I forget this is in the game. No joke, when the cutscene for the second and third Dark Dax levels started, I was like, oh yeah, that's something I've got to do. Great. It's that forgettable. It doesn't even make sense anyway. Daxter's an Otzel, a Precursor. Precursors touched by Dark Eco or Dark Makers, as seen in Jak III. This one was a high-impact original. Besides all that, the story is just so boring and lame in this. Kira gets captured by the Sky Pirate Captain, Phoenix, but they're actually good guys and the Europans are really evil, experimenting on people with Dark Eco like Praxis did, and we get these story beats like a love triangle, a shocking betrayal of one of Phoenix's pirates, a gradual truce and friendship with Jak and Phoenix. It's just all so one note and predictable, in one ear and out the other. Although I noticed something. Phoenix never introduced himself in the opening cutscene, but when Kira is captured, Jak somehow knows his name when nobody told him it.
I've got Phoenix's ship on the scope. He's not gonna get away that easy.
But then when Kira knows his name, Jak is shocked.
Phoenix, don't.
Phoenix? What, you're on a first-name basis now?
As I was saying, it all comes together in this lengthy scene where Phoenix sacrifices himself for the greater good and the day is saved and more adventures are coming, and I don't care. Thank goodness the game is over. That's all I'm left thinking at this point in the game. I revisit games I used to complain about in a curious sense. Maybe something will be different this time after all the time that's passed. But in the case of Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier, it's everything you've heard at this point. It's an easy E tier from me. When it's not frustrating, it's boring. When it's not boring, it's just a stale imitation of the Jak trilogy. For PSP standards, it's just not that good, considering that other imitations of PS2 games fared a lot better than this. And honestly, I'm not sure how this ranks in the high-impact hierarchy, if that's what you want to call it. This is the one people dislike the most of the three, and I must say, the game combined the frustration of Size Matters with the boredom of Agent Clank. Not to say Agent Clank wasn't frustrating, but that's not the biggest takeaway with the game. That is grounds for me to say it's the worst of the three, although this game isn't quite as soul-devouring to play as Agent Clank was. Sounds weird, but you just gotta play that game to know what I'm talking about. So there's that. I do think I'd replay Size Matters before this, though. Not that that's saying much, because I wouldn't want to play that game either. I really don't have that much else to add on this one. It's not good, and I don't think I'll ever play it again, seeing as I never even thought about touching it once between my original review from 6.5 years ago to now. But it is a shame that the Jak series went out with this quite weak note. To this day, Jak and Daxter have been seen in various crossover games and cameos, but this was indeed the last game in the series. But we currently live in a pop culture landscape heavily influenced by nostalgia. With PS2 games all turning 20 years old now, I think it's entirely possible, if not likely, that Jak and Daxter will make a return. Now, what I want them to do with it is a completely different question. Jak is such a unique mixture of different mechanics that I don't know if it would translate as well to the modern day as Ratchet & Clank gameplay does. But maybe that's a chance to do something much different with Jak and Daxter. Honestly, I have no idea what they would do with it now, but I'd be curious to see it either way. Personally, I'm pretty happy with the Jak series the way it is. By that I mean, every couple of years I'll go back to play Jaks 1 through X and be happy with the experience as is, remembering the games for what they were and having a good time. Not being sad the series is gone, but glad it happened at all, to the point where if it never came back, I'd be content with the games we got. A lot of people in the PlayStation platformer community, and I'm talking about people who are so deep in that the only franchises they like are these 5, they seem to have a serious resentment and hatred towards new games and the new franchises these PS2 platformer companies did after these franchises that sold a lot better. I don't hate Uncharted, The Last of Us, Infamous, or Ghost of Tsushima, especially those new Sucker Punch games, so I barely even played the former and never played the latter. And having played the Naughty Dog games, I love Uncharted, and I think The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time. But my point is, I've seen a lot of people resent these franchises for taking away our precious PlayStation platformers that really were never that popular to begin with, especially Sly Cooper. I just enjoy those newer games for what they are, and I'm really happy to see these companies that made my childhood favorites continue to be successful to this day doing the games they want to do, breaking boundaries in the industry they never could have dreamed up on PlayStation 2. So yeah, I don't need to see Jak come back. If it does happen, I'd be happy. Would love to see the Demolition duo one last time, but if it doesn't, I'd be content. And generally, I think people in online discourse need to consume nostalgia in a healthier manner, but that's neither here nor there. I don't need to soapbox about that today, considering I could make a good video on that in the future. But having said all that, I'm glad that I got to go back one more time and give Jak and Daxter the definitive retrospective it deserved, as I think these are some of my best works, which is what I said about my Ratchet videos last summer that I think are nowhere near as good as these Jak videos, so I'd say my work's only improving much more each year and is only going up from here. But that pretty much covers it for this video, so next up, I've got some anniversaries I'd like to celebrate, so I hope you'll join me for that. In the meantime, I'll say what I always do. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.